Let me welcome each of you to our meeting this morning. I'm personally delighted to look out in the audience and see so many familiar faces and old friends. I thank you for joining us. Let me begin this morning by thanking four people who have been instrumental in the success of this effort. Dan Porterfield, Walter Isaacson, Bob Steele, and Jim Crown. They have provided not just phenomenal leadership for the Aspen Institute, but have also been an enormous help in forming the Aspen Economic Strategy Group. I'm going to start this morning with something you may find to be strange and unusual, but with the bad news, and hopefully we can go from there. We have just witnessed the longest government shutdown in the history of our country. We've gotten a real first glimpse of what divided government is going to look like over the next several years. And the dysfunction we see only fuels the disintegration of trust in our already weak political institutions. From Congress to the presidency to our political parties, Americans have lost trust, lost confidence, and lost faith in the building blocks of our American democracy. And that, my friends, to me, is truly tragic. And since we're here today to talk about economic policy, it's clear the economic agendas on the right and the left are further apart today than at any other point in my memory. And at 73, while my memory isn't always clear, it is pretty long lasting. But Hank and I didn't come here this morning to talk to you about only the bad news. There is, without question, a silver lining. Hank and I have witnessed, as we've traveled around the country, a hunger for new ideas and an urgency to create better structures and smarter policies. There are many groups similar to this one that we have formed here at Aspen that are emerging throughout the country, groups which seek to reinforce the importance of facts and evidence in the policymaking process. There are also many groups committed to strengthening the social and political institutions that preserve and protect the principles of good governance that sustain our democratic policymaking process. I believe your attendance here today speaks to this. At least I certainly hope it does. For sure, this new era of divided government presents many obstacles, but it also demonstrates to us quite clearly the necessity of bipartisanship. To be sure, working in a bipartisan manner is highly frustrating. Both Hank and I have the scars to prove it. But anyone who has spent any meaningful time in this city knows that we aren't going to solve any of the pressing economic issues, such as trade, spending, taxation, immigration, income inequality, or the lack of economic mobility, without first having the ability and the will to make principled compromise. And as my old pal Alan Simpson once said, if you can't compromise without compromising your principles, you better never be a legislator, you better never get a job, and for God's sake, you better never get married. But this is why we established the Economic Strategy Group. We established it to promote economic policy ideas that are rooted in facts and rigorous analysis, and to facilitate bipartisan dialogue about these ideas. Dialogue that would lead to relationships would enable us to build up trust, and hopefully to meaningful progress in solving some of our problems. Our hope is this will be one small step toward restoring and rejuvenating the norms of bipartisan good faith in our policymaking process. I believe the panels we have set up today and the work of the Economic Strategy Group we've set up that underpins them will shed light on these challenges and will help move fact-based policy discussion forward here in Washington. Hank has more to say about this and the work of our group. So without further ado, let me turn over this platform to my longtime friend and co-chair of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group and the 73rd Secretary of the Treasury, Hank Paulson. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Erskine, and thank you all for being here today. Now, Erskine has just given you a good overview of the political backdrop today, so I thought I'd just say a few additional words giving you some economic context. If you're just reading the economic headlines about job numbers and growth, you might think everything is all going pretty well. But the truth is that far too many American workers and families are falling behind. Low and middle income wages have stagnated now for decades. Geographic disparities in income and opportunities have widened. And the ability of American children to grow up and earn more than their parents is eroding. These problems stem from profound economic changes happening in America today and frankly around much of the rest of the world. They are structural, they're not cyclical, and therefore they're not easy to reverse. But we wouldn't be working on these issues if we thought they are insurmountable. Progress is possible, and as Erskine has just said, we see many opportunities for both sides, for Democrats and Republicans, to come together to address a range of festering issues from wage stagnation to low levels of labor force participation to the need to upskill the workforce. But as Erskine said, we aren't going to get very far on these issues without a commitment to evidence-based analysis and principled compromise. These are the principles that have guided the Aspen Economic Strategy Group over the past year. We believe they have served us well in our pursuit to craft smart and effective economic policies, and we are pleased to share some of our ideas this morning during today's event. Now, we have an extraordinary lineup of speakers for you today, and a big thank you to each of them for their time and for their contributions. Thank you to Jared Bernstein, Joshua Gottlieb, Kevin Hassett, Chris Liddell, David Newmark, Juan Salgado, Rahm Emanuel, Catherine Rampel, and Jim Zeliak for lending us your expertise today. And thank you to the following authors and members of the Economic Strategy Group who will be joining today's panels: Melissa Kearney, Glenn Hubbard, Austin Goolsby, Penny Pritzker, Greg Ip, and Mitch Daniels. Finally, a thank you to all of the members of the Economic Strategy Group who are here today and those that couldn't be here today for your contributions to our work. I'm looking forward to our discussions today and to learning. And now it's my great pleasure to turn the meeting over to Melissa Kearney, who is the director of the Aspen Strategy Group, and she's done a terrific job working with Amy, and she is going to moderate the first panel. So, Melissa?
First panel. I think we're, yeah, come on up. Okay. So we're waiting for one more to join us. There he is. Great, right on cue. Thanks, Kevin. So thanks for being with us this morning. The backdrop for this panel is really the erosion of economic security that so many Americans have experienced over the past few decades. Hank referred to some of the trends that we've been talking about. the decline in employment among many prime age adults, in particular those without a college degree, wage stagnation, again for non-college educated Americans in particular, the growth in income inequality driven by disproportionate gains at the top. And so against this backdrop of challenges, this panel is focused on particular policy aims, specifically two aims of increasing employment rates and increasing wages for workers who have been struggling in the US. We have a fabulous lineup. We're really grateful to have three of our authors, our outside authors, who wrote memos that are in the volume, which hopefully you all have and surely will leave with. I will just introduce the three of them in turn. Josh Gottlieb, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of British Columbia. He's widely recognized as an expert in urban and housing economics, also healthcare, but we're not going to go there today. And then Jim Ziliak, who holds the Gatton Endowed Chair in Microeconomics at the University of Kentucky, where he's also Director of the Center for Poverty Research and Executive Director of the Kentucky Federal Statistical Research Data Center. Jim is one of the nation's preeminent experts on US poverty and social safety net programs. And David Newmark, the Chancellor's Professor of Economics at the University of California, Irvine, and Director of the Economic Self-Sufficiency Policy Research Institute. David is a renowned labor economist and an expert on labor markets and labor market policies. So we're really fortunate to have two guests here today to comment on the proposals that these authors are going to tell us about. Kevin Hassett is the current chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, coming from his position as a resident scholar at AEI. And Jared Bernstein is a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. He previously served as chief economist and economic advisor to Vice President Biden in the Obama administration. So we have a lot to cover. We're going to be very efficient about this. I will stop the panel conversation with about 10 to 15 minutes remaining in this session, so we have some time for Q&A from the audience. You'll notice that there are index cards on your seat, and so someone will come around near the end of our session and collect those and bring them up to us. Okay, let's start with you, Josh. So Josh wrote a proposal that's in your volume, and it's focused on zoning reform. And the point of this reform is to make housing more affordable in some of the superstar areas. So Josh, as part of the background motivation in your proposal, you mention what I find is a startling statistic. You say that US GDP is nearly $2 trillion below its potential as a result of land use regulations and zoning restrictions. So before getting into the specifics of your proposal, explain to us this link. Why is zoning and house prices so instrumental to wages and productivity?
Well, this comes from the fact that you just alluded to, Melissa, which is that cities and regions across the US are very different in their productivity and the opportunities they provide. Places like San Francisco, Boston, New York, Washington, when it's not shut down, provide many different opportunities, greater opportunities because they're more productive, they have ideas, they have links between suppliers and their customers, big labor markets. These create a lot of opportunities, and Americans who are looking for opportunity very often would like to move to these places. But the municipalities in these areas have a tendency to tell outsiders, no, you can't come in. They use very strict zoning and roadblocks to permitting new construction to keep outsiders out. Because of the basic forces of supply and demand, if you restrict the supply of housing, you raise prices, and then causes people to choose to not go to these places, even though they would increase their skills and increase their opportunities. So a few different teams of authors have run the numbers on this and added up all of the lost productivity and the lost wages from these restrictions, and they come up with these enormous numbers on the order of 10% of GDP.
Okay, so now tell us what you propose that governments can do to ameliorate this problem.
Well, it's a problem that comes from governments, so it's inherently a bit challenging to say what are governments going to do to fix it. So what I propose in the volume is that we look at the different levels of government. So localities, municipalities, are the sources of many of these problems. And it makes sense from the perspective of self-interest. If you're a municipality and you want to raise your own housing values, one way to do that is by restricting supply. Now, they don't then take into account the knock-on effects of these supply restrictions on people elsewhere, people who are not current voting members of that location. So I propose that state governments, which have the power to regulate what municipalities can do, should take a hard look at what they're allowing their municipalities to do. And specifically, I propose an alternative channel for zoning and permitting. So I call it minimum zoning mandates. You can think of it as an alternative zoning code or an alternative permitting process where state governments would say, look, there are certain types of residential construction that are just sensible and you should be able to build them in anywhere where you're allowed to build. This is of course not saying that you could go put an industrial plant in the middle of a residential neighborhood, but that the sort of medium density places that allow a lot of people to congregate, create a lot of opportunities and frankly interesting neighborhoods, I think a lot of people think, that should be allowed without a big rigmarole and without giving neighbors the opportunity to keep that away.
So given the legality of our fiscal federalism system, can states do this?
States can do this. States create municipalities. States create the powers that municipalities have. If the federal government were to come in and tell municipalities what to do, that would be more challenging. There are proposals out there to use federal power, but those tend to be more fiscal. Federal government could give financial encouragement to states or to municipalities to loosen zoning, but they can't necessarily tell the states, here's how your zoning process is going to work. States can do this.
Great. So who are the winners and losers under your proposal?
The winners, as with many good proposals, I think are pretty diffuse, right? If you increase opportunity, then the people who might move to San Francisco or Washington or New York, we don't know who they are right now. They could be anywhere. They would benefit from lower rents, from more affordable housing that would emerge when zoning restrictions are weakened. Losers is a bit more complicated. And I should say on the winner side, also firms, right? If you can have more workers, you can have more ideas flowing. That's great for the economy. Losers are more complicated. Existing homeowners are frequently worried about what more zoning, more housing would do to their home values. But it's important to think about the difference here between land and homes. What I'm proposing is to use land more efficiently. Right now, this restrictive zoning or exclusionary zoning, it's sometimes called, actually might depress land values because it's keeping land from being used for its most productive use. So no one's suggesting that we go in and tell a particular landowner or a particular municipality, you have to build a lot here. If the landowner wants to build more, presumably that's because it's beneficial for them. They're currently not allowed to replace, say, a single-family home with row houses. If they were allowed to do that, their land value might go up even as the cost of an individual housing unit goes down.
Okay. All right, so I want to make sure we have time to get all the proposals on the table, but one more quick question. So aside from the 4 cities you've mentioned, San Francisco, New York, Boston, D.C., how big of a deal is this elsewhere? Are there other places that this is a real problem?
This is very widespread. Let me give you a sense of the magnitude of what we're talking about here. There's work by Albert Saiz that calculated how restrictive and how difficult it is to get new housing in different areas. And one statistic I found looking at his numbers is in order to get an equal number of housing units, extra housing units built in Washington, D.C. versus in Charlotte, North Carolina, prices in Washington have to go up by twice as much. And that's not the most extreme example. And Charlotte's a perfectly productive city as well. And it's sort of somewhere near the middle of this distribution. This problem is very widespread to the extent that $2 trillion of GDP is lost.
Yep. Great, thank you. Okay, so Jim, you also focus on divergence across areas in their economic productivity. And I have to say, Jim's piece in this volume is really one of the most striking pieces I've read, outlining just how far behind in economic terms rural America has been faring as compared to more metro or urban areas. So Jim, you had one statistic in your piece that only 1 in 2 low-skilled men in non-metro areas are currently working. And you point out that not that long ago, employment rates among men in metro and non-metro areas weren't actually all that different. You also have some depressing statistics about how far behind adults in rural areas have fallen in terms of educational attainment. So before we talk about the specifics of your proposal, can you elaborate a bit on what's going on in sort of rural areas, rural labor markets, as compared to urban areas?
Yeah, thanks so much. It's really kind of defies logic when you look at overall statistics in the United States, especially education attainment. Things have looked pretty good overall if you look over the course of the last 50 years, but if you break the data up by location of residence, where people live, things have changed quite a bit between urban America and rural America. So, for example, the fraction of men with college degrees in rural America is the same today as it was in 1985, which is only about 15%. And that's a huge 30 percentage point gap between urban America that didn't exist, 50 years ago. And so what we're seeing with that slowdown in education attainment is a real slowdown in earnings. And so another startling statistic in the paper is the fact that college-educated men in rural America are earning the same in inflation-adjusted terms as they were in the late 1960s, about $1,000 a week. And so what's known as the urban wage premium, certainly Josh thinks hard about that, in his work, has really gone to only high-skilled men in urban areas. And so the rural communities have been left behind. That big push towards technology and the role of technology and the payoff and the return to schooling hasn't really affected rural America. Part of what we're seeing as a consequence is that young people tend to move out of the rural places, and so the population is aging faster in rural America than it is urban America. We used to have greater return migration of young people after they finish college. They're less likely to return to the home place today, and so fertility rates certainly are not enough to offset that declining population. There is return migration, but it tends to be people older in their 50s and above who return to kind of their home place after their work careers. And so this is creating a real substantial economic challenge for rural places.
Yeah, you had a phrase in there that says there's both the lack of supply and the lack of demand for skill in these rural markets. Okay, so you've been studying these trends and you know the evidence for more than anyone, I think. What do you propose that places can do about this?
So I propose a twofold strategy of bringing people to jobs and jobs to people. So the people to jobs, there's a subset of the rural population who are mobile. They're willing to move to work either permanently or temporarily. And so, but they lack the resources to make that change. And so, I'm going to be chewing on this here, I guess. They lack the resources to make that change. And so what we have is a proposal, one for permanent moves, or a relocation assistance program. And so this would offer people who are capable of moving to new opportunities and locations, at least 2 commuting zones beyond their current residence, offer them assistance for moving costs, down payment on housing, as well as a temporary stipend that would last for about the first 6 months of their move. And we have a little history on these types of programs in the United States, not a lot. The most well-known relocation program is what's known as the Moving to Opportunity program. That was actually a housing assistance program. The goal was to reduce poverty across generations with the MTO, but it wasn't an explicit jobs program. It was really kind of a more neighborhood change program where improved access to better jobs might be a positive byproduct of that. After the 1996 welfare reform, 2 locations actually offered relocation assistance to former welfare recipients. One of those places was my state of Kentucky, and the other was Tulare County, California. And there was one formal evaluation of the Kentucky program that showed some real positive change in terms of earnings for people that did move. There has not been a formal evaluation of the California experiment demonstration, but the suggestive evidence is that it had a real positive effect on those people that participated. The most solid evidence on this policy is in Germany, which has a very active labor market program overall, where they've done these relocation assistance programs showing earnings of movers relative to stayers have risen about 25%. A related policy proposal on the people to jobs is commuters credit. So transportation is the second largest budget item for the typical American. And it takes a larger share out of the budget for rural Americans than urban Americans. And so there are many people that, for whatever reason, don't want to move or can't move from their current location. Yet if they want to find access to better jobs, they oftentimes have to commute, oftentimes several counties, and so out of their own commuting zone. And so this would be a temporary commuter's credit that would last up to 12 months, that would provide a subsidy to workers to help cover these transportation costs as they transition to new work. By the way, these strategies are for people who have been displaced from work for at least a half year, what we would typically refer to as kind of the long-term unemployed or displaced workers. And the reason for that is to help assist those who are having a harder time picking themselves back up economically. The other part of this strategy is to bring jobs to people. And for this part of the proposal, I'm emphasizing that the policy roll out first on the most disadvantaged population in our country. And there's about 11% of counties that the U.S. Department of Agriculture characterizes as persistently poor. And these are counties that have poverty rates in excess of 20% or more in every year since 1980. And so these are communities that are spread throughout the United States. They are predominantly rural communities in the South as well as in the West. And the people to jobs, or the jobs to people proposal, there's threefold. One would be a major expansion of rural broadband. So 50 years ago, the big infrastructure challenges in rural America were transportation, were potable water, kind of basics that we took for granted in urban places. Today, it's the digital world. It's the digital infrastructure, and rural Americans, only about 40% lack access to broadband in rural America, compared to about 4% in urban. So there's a real rural-urban digital divide there. So the idea is to create market opportunities for local manufacturers, craftspeople, but also to open up the opportunity for telework. So the rural broadband is both a people to jobs as well as a jobs to people strategy. Next, once people are wired in these rural communities, local firms need access to capital. And so the USDA has run a number of programs assisting local communities, oftentimes through state and local governments or institutions of higher ed. So they're a real partnership between the federal and state and local governments to help provide small loans and business development for microenterprise and other firms locating in those communities. And then third is for the most disadvantaged part of the population in rural America. And these are for people who aren't equipped to take a commuter's credit, aren't financial or manufacturing entrepreneurs, so really can't take necessarily advantage. And so this would be a program of public works. So if you go around rural America, there's a lot of the work that was done infrastructure-wise was done after the Great Depression. And for many of these communities, not much has been done to maintain that infrastructure in the ensuing period. And so for that population that struggles the most in finding work, we would create a system of public works programs.
Great. So one thing that strikes me about your jobs to the people set of proposals is, one, I appreciated the specificity of it. You actually have an idea of what these people would do.
Sorry. Okay. Now we're on.
Okay, good. But it's also, it's both more specific and also much more targeted and perhaps even modest in scope than some of the other universal jobs programs that are floating around. So why did you decide to propose something this targeted as opposed to just guaranteeing a job for any American who wants one?
Yeah, part of it I think is cost containment. I do think that we do have to have a system where jobs are available to people who struggle the most, and that's kind of the second part. So, but there are other people who are much closer to the margin of work and not work, and so they don't necessarily need the access to that government-provided job or job guarantee, but they need that little extra financial boost to allow them to seek that opportunity.
Okay, so some of these other proposals I've seen come with a price tag that would create an entitlement program on the order of like what Medicare is.
Right.
What's the price tag? Can you give us rough numbers on what something like what you're proposing would cost?
Sure. On the people to jobs, those would range, maximum credit that you would be eligible for under the proposal for the relocation would be just over $6,000. So if 100,000 long-term unemployed would take it up, then we would be looking at roughly around $1 billion allocation for that, which is tiny compared to Medicare, for example. And if we look at the commuter's credit, it would be between $500 million and $1 billion for this temporary commuter's credit. The rural broadband, there was a proposal put out through the Brookings Institution about a year ago, proposing about a $20 billion investment in rural broadband, and that seems to be about the right number for that program, because that's a major infrastructure change in some of these hard to build communities. So it ranges from relatively small investments to much more sizable financial investments.
Great, and you have a menu of policy options. So just last question before we move on, which do you think would have the greatest bang for the buck?
Wow, that's tough. All right, so one thing, I have my talking points here that I didn't use. So one thing before I answer your question, we are in DC, so it's deflect, right? Deflect. So one thing that I want to make clear in the policy proposals is that what I'm suggesting in my agenda today is what we might call active labor market policy for the current population of adults, okay? Really to address systemic poverty in rural America, it requires a massive investment in our children through education, pre-K through higher ed, which will lead to the discussion in the next panel, and also health. And so it's important to recognize this is current active labor market policy. What do I think would be the most important long-term investment of these active labor market policies? I think the rural broadband is the one that is the most important one, because I think that there's just too many missed opportunities right now in the current marketplace that rural America is just not being able to participate in.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's move on to David. So for those of you who don't know David's academic research, he has written numerous papers over the years on all sorts of wage and hiring credit and labor market policies. And for this volume, David's proposed a higher wages tax credit. Okay, David, tell us what issues are you trying to address with this proposal?
Thanks. As some of you may know, minimum wages are going up and maybe going up a lot higher. My colleagues like to tease me that I'm clearly losing this battle, to which I respond, they would only be higher if not for my research. But the point is, higher minimum wages are popular with the voters. They're popular with politicians, perhaps because of the first point, that they're popular with voters, but also perhaps because they can appear to be doing something about inequality without having to raise taxes, which I think is part of the issue I'm trying to address. I also am convinced, there is debate about this, of course, but I'm convinced that while minimum wages clearly deliver some benefits, some workers earn higher wages, obviously, there are some adverse effects on employment and hours worked, some potentially longer-term adverse effects. Obviously, those of you who follow literature know that not everybody agrees, but I think almost all economists of every stripe are at least uncomfortable with some of the high minimum wages we're talking about, at least as applied to some of the lower wage areas of the country, minimum wages that might cover 40, 45, even a higher percentage of the workforce. So the idea behind this policy is to kind of recognize the momentum towards minimum wages and rather than just say don't do it, to say how might we ameliorate this policy to make it somewhat more effective, reduce some of the adverse effects, and then a bit more pie in the sky perhaps, rebalance in some sense the discussion about redistributional policies.
Okay, so this is a really sort of, I think, creative and out-of-the-box proposal. So outline it for us. How does it
Okay.
work?
So the basic idea, first of all, I sort of love the challenge of, like it says on the sign right there, bipartisan policies. I'm pegged as a San Francisco liberal by some folks and an anti-worker conservative by others. I'm probably more the first than the second, actually. But I actually really try very hard, not just for my homework here, but in general, to think about policies that might attract support from both sides. Why? Because they're more likely to get adopted. And I think that's important. We're trying to actually make better policy, not just come up with ideas that will never get enacted. So the idea here, it's way simpler than yours, for sure. I'm not sure. I think you understand.
No offense.
The idea simply is to, there's a lot of details, but the basic idea is, and this could be done at any level of jurisdiction, but when a jurisdiction passes a minimum wage increase, you put in place a hiring credit that offsets roughly half the increase, and essentially a calculation of kind of the average wage of those who are paid below the minimum wage, what's the increase up to the new minimum wage, and you do that because then you don't have to worry about what you do for new workers. But essentially, you share half the cost of the increase between the employers who are hiring these workers and the taxpayers who are, through their elected representatives, saying you should pay this higher wage. Aside from that, there's really only two other little details. One is how do you work this out so that with inflation, as the minimum wage becomes less relevant to the wage, it erodes. That's in the proposal. How do you structure it so that if a jurisdiction raises its minimum wage and then raises it again 2 years later, how do you account for that? All that's taken account of. It's actually not that complicated. The other thing I suggest is that we consider having this credit only for people with a high school education or less. And that's in part to improve the targeting a little bit. We know that the minimum wage doesn't target low-income people very well. Obviously it does to some extent, but it's a pretty blunt instrument. There's a lot of minimum wage workers in high-income families. It's really hard to tie a policy to family income because the administrative burden of doing that is probably overwhelming. But at least if you tie it to less educated people, you're more likely to be hitting families with somewhat lower income. And in the sort of simulations and cost estimates we do, you actually see that. And let me just point, the last point isn't so much about the details of the proposal, but the point I was making about policy discussion. I think right now we think about, we know there's rising inequality, we've heard about it, we know the facts, both parties talk about it, different solutions obviously. Politicians are clearly trying to respond to the inequality problem. We have a number of possible tools we might use. The minimum wage obviously has an intuitive appeal. It certainly reduces inequality of wages of working people, right? By construction. It has to do that. But the attraction of it, I think, for policymakers and perhaps the public is it comes with what seems like a zero price tag, but it isn't. So if you're going to ask me the follow-up question, what does this cost? I'm going to say it doesn't necessarily cost any more because we're paying for it anyways. Yeah. But I do think what a higher minimum wage would, what the tax credit for a higher minimum wage would do, or the higher wages tax credit as we've called it, is build in a recognition that this is like any other redistributional policy and it has a cost and we need to think about what the cost is, and if we really think it's better than other policies on the merits, we should be willing to pay for it. And if, having actually now done a more sensible accounting of what a policy's A, B, and C cost, we decide other policies are better, well, that's all for the good.
So you've essentially cleverly attached a price tag for the local or state governments that want to raise their minimum wage. So a cynic might say you've shifted the cost burden from the businesses to the government, and in so doing, this would contribute to sort of a stalling of minimum wage legislation.
Right. So I'm sensitive to that criticism, that I'm just sort of throwing sand in the wheels. I think I'd say a couple things. First of all, we can't really shift costs to the government. We can shift costs to the taxpayers. And I think that's part of the potential virtue here, right? Because right now, think about what we're trying to do with the minimum wage. We're trying to get more money into the hands of low-income people. And we know already the minimum wage does a not great job of that, but it does that to some extent. And like other redistributional policies, we'd like to take that money presumably from those who make the most. That's what redistributional policy does. And if we're going to do it, that's the sensible way to do it. Well, the minimum wage doesn't really do that as it stands now, right? The guy who owns the laundromat pays the minimum wage, the investment banker doesn't. I don't think the guys who own the laundromats are the ones who are at the top of our income distribution. Now, obviously, there are corporations out there also making a lot of money that hire a lot of low-wage workers. But currently, a lot of high-income taxpayers are not on the hook for this at all. And I think in that sense, while it might throw some sand in the wheels, it does redistribution the way it should be done. I would also suggest that a lot of the opposition to higher minimum wages does come from businesses, and this would actually lower the price to businesses. And in that sense, it might get more buy-in because this now becomes sort of a shared burden to help people at the bottom that's shared between the businesses who hire them and the government. And that could actually work in the opposite direction of easing the policy.
Great. So, so one of the things it seems your proposal would achieve is ameliorating the potential adverse employment effects of a higher minimum wage. Why did you not just propose something more direct, like a hiring tax credit?
Well, in some sense, depending on how it's structured, and I read the proposal by Jason and Phil, which is like a hiring tax credit conditional on paying a certain wage. I mean, that's not at the end of the day that different, right? A flat-out hiring tax credit doesn't. It could work the same way or it couldn't, depending on how you do it, right? The higher wage tax credit that's based on the minimum wage will respond to something that is essentially a distortion introduced by the government and trying to ameliorate the effects while still achieving some of the goals. Outright hiring tax credits, I have some sympathy for them, but they're also hard to structure well. I try to build into this, I think, something that will really target the people whose price has been pushed up and try to ameliorate the effects, and try to do less to have the problem that many hiring credits have, which is just windfalls to a lot of employers for hiring they would have done anyways.
Terrific. Okay, real quick, I just want to take you outside your proposal for a minute because I'd love to hear you say a word about how do you think about the substitutability or complementarity of minimum wage policy and the EITC?
Right. That's a good question. So people often say, why not both? And there is something to the why
Sorry,
not.
let's just be clear. The EITC is the Earned Income Tax Credit.
Earned Income Tax Credit, right, which basically subsidizes your wage. It induces employment among low-skilled people with kids because they're eligible for the most generous credit, pushes down market wages to some extent because labor supply increases. I think the simple view that you need to raise the minimum wage to offset the wage reductions that the EITC creates is sort of the wrong way to think about it because that would just kind of shut down the EITC effect, right? The EITC increases employment because it lowers cost to firms, so we don't want to do that. That said, I have some work that says when you raise the minimum wage and the EITC together, you actually increase the positive effects of the EITC on the group that the EITC helps. You induce more low-skilled single mothers to enter the labor market. The teenagers who compete with them get absolutely clobbered under that policy combination. But I do think there's something to that. But I have a strong preference for the EITC if I have to choose one or the other. The EITC encourages work. We know it increases employment. There's incontrovertible evidence on that. I have work that I've done through my center, the Economic Self-Sufficiency Policy Research Institute, which shows beneficial long-term effects of the EITC, right? Women with kids growing up, if you will, through the 20s and 30s under a more generous EITC are actually earning more in their 40s. And that's a pretty striking result. We don't have really solid evidence on the long-term effects of the minimum wage, but there's some hints of evidence that the long-run effects are in the opposite direction because for some people they shut down labor market opportunities.
Great, thank you. Okay, now for the reality check. We're going to hear from our two economists who live in the policy world as opposed to the academic world.
A different bubble.
Yeah, Jared, let's start with you. Give us your general reaction to the ideas we've heard about, and then also if you could comment on whether you think any of these might get some legs in the policy world.
Yeah, so I really like not just the ideas, but I want to very much associate myself with the comments that Hank and Erskine made to kick us off. I don't if anyone here has read my work, and you have no reason to do so. I tend to be, especially these days, amplifying a lot of these very bold left ideas that are coming out of prominent Democrats that are much more, much further down the political continuum than what we're talking about today. But the reason I like this project so much, and the reason I associate myself with the comments that introduced us, is because what's kind of missing is precisely this more moderate policy space
which my experience now is that there are members on the Hill who are somewhat hesitant to even go there because they don't want to be accused of not passing a kind of further left litmus test. So the fact that you're developing this policy set is really important. Even if we are able to, as Democrats, stop negotiating with ourselves, which would be very good, and make a run for the bolder ideas, we're going to have to, politics being what they are, snap back. And what are we going to snap back to? Perhaps some of the ideas that we're talking about today. So I wanted to say that first off. I think that there is, I guess what to answer your question, I think there's perhaps some political space for Jim's idea. For Josh's idea, that's not a federal thing so much. That's a level down. And I wanted to talk about the political viability of that. I think it's a very, very heavy lift. I suspect you wouldn't disagree. And then for David's idea, I don't really know, but I'll talk a little bit about, the politics, but I'll talk a little bit about that idea if I might. So can I say a few things about the policies? Because I read these papers carefully and very much enjoyed them. They're all very well written. So in terms of Josh's point, Josh said during your conversation, and this was the zoning idea, he said governments make rules, right? Well, that's true. But in a way, the zoning rules that you're talking about, the local ones, are almost the most representative level of government you can think of because it comes down almost to the block level. Now, your idea should be something that should be in place already. It's a great idea. And the reason I say it should be in place already is because it's really hard to find anyone in the policy world who opposes it. This is an idea that left and right agree on. In fact, when I'm in debates and someone says, oh, you nasty, lefty, can't you come up with one idea that somebody on the other side would like? We talk about opening up zoning. So this is something that has wide sort of analytic support, but yet you hardly see it anywhere. And that's because in a way you're trying to leapfrog a level of powerful local politics. I mean, you just have to ask yourself, I live in Virginia, a somewhat controversial government right now, with current events being what they are. But it is really hard to imagine, Richmond telling Alexandria or Arlington what to do at this level. And, we're sort of purple. I don't know that that gets easier in other places. The only other critique I have of your program is that I work with our housing team at the Center on Budget. And if, there's a theme that comes out of their work that this kind of supply side approach that you're advocating, while critically important, definitely valuable, actually probably wouldn't reach some of the lowest income people who face housing shortfalls. And for them, we really need to be talking about subsidies, and that's a federal piece. For Jim, I just wanted to say that before you leave, make sure you look at Jim's wage data, and I'm actually going to highlight something you didn't. It's not really so much about your paper, but just about the situation that was talked about in the introduction. So look at Jim's picture of wage, real median wages over the last 30 years or so. And you gave a description of kind of the relative dynamics. In fact, if you look at the most favored group, given the partitioning that Jim did, which would be metro college-educated workers, their real median wage has been flat in his graphs since 2000. It's almost 2 decades. Well, when your data ends, but it's almost 2 decades. So the extent of the wage problems that you're talking about don't just affect less than high school workers or high school workers. They affect college-educated workers. And I think that's something that we need to be mindful of. What's so great about, I think, Jim's idea is his willingness to approach both sides of the problem, people to jobs and jobs to people. And just in the interest of time, I want to be quick. I think there are a couple things that I would just sort of open up in the design of the program. I really don't see why. So yes, I understand cost containment, but I don't think you want to be penny wise, pound foolish with something like this. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't just restrict this to people who are unemployed or long-term unemployed. What about somebody who's stuck in a lousy job and wants to move somewhere and improve their lot? I think they ought to be able to access that opportunity if they could. Similarly, I understand your intention to cut off the commuting subsidy after a year, but what if you're what if there's a lot of immobility and wage stagnation out there, as your data show. What if someone's still stuck exactly where they were 12 months ago? At least I'd want to condition that on their economic situation, because you could cut their legs out from them and undermine your program. And finally, on broadband, one of the statistics I thought I read in your piece was that actually 60% of rural areas have broadband. And while I think we're all, I don't know anyone who's against this idea, by the way. This is another one I think has sort of at least rhetorical bipartisan support. Is there any work that compares the folks that have it to those that don't, that would kind of lead you to believe that this kind of has the impacts you're suggesting? I mean, I'd want to do it anyway, but I'd sort of want to know, does this just mean everybody gets a good Netflix connection, or does it really have the entrepreneurial effects you're talking about? So on David's thing, I really enjoyed David's piece, and I sort of admired your, I know David's worked for a long time. I don't want to say a surrendering, but the idea that reality.
I don't want to say it.
Yeah, the idea of reality being what it is. Maybe you can, in his case, make lemonade out of a lemon, because David's pretty skeptical of these minimum wage increases. And I thought the paper actually did suffer a bit from not citing enough of the work on the other side of the kind of elasticity fight. In terms of disemployment effects. And this weekend I made a point of reading this new paper by Aaron Dubé and Ben Zipper et al. I was particularly interested in it because David Autor, who's kind of, I think, a non-thumb on the scale arbiter, said this is a really important paper. And that paper found much, basically across the board, insignificant impacts of employment, minimum wage increases relative to employment changes, even of less skilled workers. So that's a debate out there. David has serious work on one side. Other people have serious work on the other side. He's well aware and much more of a participant in this argument than I am. But that, along with some of the other aspects of the policy that gave me pause, led me to wonder whether it was something we'd want to push very far in the following sense. I think I'd like you to talk about this. I think the administrative burden of getting firms to track the extent to which their minimum wage workers are diverging from the average between the old and the new. I mean, you can get into the mechanics of your thing. Is considerably more challenging than maybe your presentation suggested. So, I guess where I would come down is that you're scratching an itch that may not be as itchy as you think. At least, a lot of research would suggest that. Second, you're adding an administrative burden that I think is quite serious. Third, the income targeting of your thing is not very good, and that's because you're tying it to the minimum wage, which isn't as well income targeted as the EITC. The EITC is directly targeted at income, so it's a much better targeted tool. And what I would do is take whatever money you were going to put into your tax credit and just boost the earned income tax credit, which actually, I don't want to overuse this metaphor, does end up scratching a similar itch in terms of lowering the costs of low-wage labor to low-wage employers. So it's complementary in the sense that David is going after as well. Finally, in skill targeting, I actually think that skill targeting by just cutting it off at high school or less is not necessarily particularly great skill targeting either, because if you look at the association between sort of low wages and skills, it's not nearly as clean cut as you think, or at least as the policy would imply. There's people right above the high school level who face largely the same labor market as people right below. So I'm not sure, to me it was kind of weak on skill targeting, income targeting, high on administrative burden, and we've already got a tool in place that could do this better in my view. My final thing, and then I'll stop, sorry. Okay, final, is look, we do live in a country right now where we have very serious deficit problems. We'll talk about that off stage perhaps. And I do think that if you're, I don't want to be this eye shade guy who goes around with, where's your pay for? But especially with Erskine Bowles in the room, I do think we should, pay some attention to that.
Great, thank you. Kevin, you've been very patient.
Oh, sorry.
Are you ready to push for all these policies?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Note to self, if I'm on a panel with Jared, next time I'm going to bring some Benadryl lotion.
Oh, yes,
so
right.
itchy.
Yes, I get it.
But thanks to Erskine and Hank and to Amy for inviting me here. And I think if I hadn't gone into government, I would have been down that end a little bit and have written a paper for this project. I think that it's important as an economist to sort of sit back and think about this bipartisan space that we've defined here in the conversation, because I think it's really interesting, and I think I can create kind of a mental image that helps like characterize the policy problem, I think, and find places or identify places of possible agreement. I think that there are sort of people who think that markets work and that the result is the closest you're going to get to just, and that other people that worry about what happens with markets. And one thing I can say is that if you think about a mental model, let's just start with like a map of the US. If people just sort of helicopter down or parachute down onto a map of the US and then we let them trade with each other and move around and so on, then, in an economic model, then they can definitely reach a Pareto optimum equilibrium that's, beneficial to all. But the problem in the real world is, and this is something that they used to talk about way back in the day when Glenn and I were still in grad school. The problem is that if we parachute people down onto a map of the US, then a lot of times people land on flypaper and they're kind of stuck there. Now that's true geographically, but it's not true. You could also think about the exercise of starting our economic model is that where you land determines your skill. And so if where you parachute down, you land someplace, that determines your skills. And then if you can move around and get new skills, then, depending on how the economy evolves, you can get a really efficient equilibrium. But, I grew up in a distressed or near a distressed community where everybody worked at a paper mill. Everybody had really great skills for making paper, which is pretty complicated stuff, actually. But then the paper mill closed, and then then they're stuck, flypaper, they're stuck with those skills. And so I think that as we think about one of the main problems that we have in society, it's that we could all agree on the left and the right that markets aren't always going to work if there's a lot of flypaper around. And that one of the things that's happened in the literature, you mentioned Otter and Schott, and I mean, there are a lot of people who have documented that there's a heck of a lot of flypaper even today. And I can assure you that when Jared and I started working on distressed communities about, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, maybe even more, I ended up making a big human capital investment of my own into this space. And one of the very first experiences I had in the White House, and I see Chris Liddell back there, I forget, Chris, whether you were in the Oval at the time, is that we made a presentation about this sort of flypaper problem to the president, about how people are moving from high unemployment to low unemployment places, much lower, at a much lower frequency than they used to. And then right after I left the Oval, the president tweeted, "Hey, if you're having trouble finding a job, you should consider moving." It really did. It really did happen. And so I can say that in the administration that we've got lots of policies that we've been working on that address this sort of stickiness problem. And one of the main ones that's already out there is something that kind of started with you should read Jared's stuff because occasionally he has a good co-author. Jared and I wrote a paper a long time ago about distressed communities and how to attract capital to them, and that paper I think led in part to the Opportunity Zone tax law that became law about a year ago. And I know there was a lot of that bill you didn't like, but that part I'm pretty sure you liked. And so that will hopefully send capital to the places where, and it's kind of interesting, send the jobs to the places where people are kind of stuck. But another thing that we're worried about is the stickiness of skills. And we've paid a lot of attention to the fact that with technological innovation and artificial intelligence and robots and so on, that we're increasingly moving towards a world where people might be stuck with the wrong skills. And we've got this Council for the American Worker where we're basically charged over a 2-year period with trying to reshape government programs to help people reskill. And so that's the perspective from the administration. I think that once you think about it as a kind of flypaper problem, then you'll see that there are a lot of good ideas that should get bipartisan support. And I think Zoning reform is one. The question of whether there's a federal role there or not is something for the think tanks. It's not something that I would have a strong opinion about. But there have been times, historically, where the federal government has come up with a sort of carrot or a stick to try to get stuff to improve. And I think it's clear. I'm convinced by the literature that zoning restrictions are causing major harm to the economy. And you think about like the way the drinking age got moved or something like. Maybe there's some creative stuff that could happen in that space. I think that. The relocation subsidies, that's something that Mike Strain at AEI has been pushing for a while. And again, if you think of like the fundamental economic problem as being a flypaper-like problem, then you could definitely expect that would be something that would address it. I think that there's other stuff in the flypaper space where there should be broad bipartisan support. I think, I have every economic report of the president. You had it in your office too, right? And you too, all the way back to 1946, is sitting on my bookshelf behind my desk, and I love to just grab it at some time at the end of the day, and it's actually relaxing to read it. But there's a lot of great chapters in Austin's ERPs and in Jason Furman's last economic report of the president. They had a great chapter that talked about occupational licensing and how that creates kind of like this flypaper effect. That's another thing to think about. The final thought on the minimum wage, I would just say, is that the thing that, as an economist, I've sort of always, and I've been a fan of David's work since I was a colleague of Bill Washer's long ago when you first started writing those papers together, is that if I'm writing it down as a public finance economist, the problem of social justice, then I have a social welfare function, and I've got inequality aversion, and the mathematical problem is sort of, say, to move stuff around so that we get a more just equilibrium. And it never made sense to me that if we think that we want to redistribute, that the optimal way to redistribute would be to basically impose a tax on the guy who gives the low-income guy a job. That I kind of think that for me, the conversation always struck me as it'd be more logical if we viewed it as maximizing a social welfare function problem, and then recognize that we collectively should share the burden of social justice. We shouldn't target the burden onto one very narrow segment of society. And so that makes me, I guess, more, not as a White House person, but as an economist, more sympathetic to the kind of thing that David's talking about.
Great, thank you. So we do have time for a couple questions. So if you could pass your index card with your question to someone who's walking around, we'll pose your questions to the extent there's time to our panelists. So I'm glad you brought up skills. Our next panel will all be about skills, which is unfortunately why we can't continue this conversation for another hour. So there's clearly plenty of material. So while they're collecting the questions, do either one of you want to quick respond to something that Jared or Kevin said?
I'll just make one quick response, and it won't be to debate the minimum wage evidence, because that wouldn't be quick. But in terms of why not just increase the EITC? I mean, first of all, I'm on board with increasing the EITC. I'm not on board with increasing the minimum wage. This is more along the lines of, if we're going to, what might we do instead? But I do think there's one difference about, and you said it lowers the cost of labor to employers the same way this credit would, but this credit lowers it for people whose wages are being forced up by the minimum wage. And the EITC, of course, reaches a lot more people and lowers the cost of labor for people, for firms hiring a much broader swath of people. So it's more targeted in that sense.
Great. So there are a couple questions here related to the idea of training and upskilling and whose responsibility is that. And so I'm going to punt on those for the next panel, because that's a big topic of conversation for the next panel. Here's a question about essentially the fact that what we've been talking about is really for long-term or middle-run related issues, and this person points out that there are people who are vulnerable to the recession shocks, right? So more cyclical challenges. Do one of you want to say, or a couple of you want to say something about sort of how you think about the cyclical challenges and what the best response would be versus the more structural challenges that we've been focused on?
So I'm going to speak to that because it's an issue that relates both to my proposal and to Jim's, which is one way that in an ideal world people would be able to react to either structural or cyclical downturns is by moving. And one of the things that happens with both the zoning issues that I'm raising and with the general divergence of urban and rural areas is that channel for people to take into their own hands, how can I resolve my problem, is being hampered.
Great.
I would like to, so I kind of taking Jared's point about maybe opening these programs up, don't be so stingy. Clearly, there is a real counter-cyclical component of the people to jobs, right? The relocation assistance, commuters credits, could be a very effective counter-cyclical policy during those periods. So exactly, kind of opening it up.
I want to stick with you on that because this person must have listened to David Outer's talk at the ASSA meetings in which he mentioned that low-skilled workers in urban areas aren't doing so hot anymore either.
Yeah.
And so then this relates to your proposal that people move. Are there places for low-skilled people to move to where they'll do okay?
I think that still the difference is you're going to move from an area without many job opportunities to an area with job opportunities, but the challenge in those areas is wage stagnation, which pervades the entire skill distribution, as Jared mentioned as well. So the difference is employment versus not.
Okay.
That's a big difference.
Can I add on the cyclical point, and this is just a technical point that Jared and I have talked a lot about over the years, that they're not really separable in the sense that, so for example, if the unemployment insurance extends to 99 weeks, then you run the risk of encouraging people to stay out of the labor force for so long that they get really hard to reattach. And so when we're thinking about like future policies and changes to policies, then the interaction between the cyclical effect and the long run effect could be really quite large. And so imagine if instead of extending to 99 weeks, you made it so that you could take some money to relocate or something like that. That I think that's a policy space that I encourage you folks to sort of dig deep into.
Great.
One more.
Jared and David,
Okay,
final
quick,
words.
This is a sentence, quick macro point. One thing that does keep me up at night is I am very worried that when we hit the next downturn, we're going to have too little monetary space and too little perceived fiscal space to really hit back as hard as we need to.
I was going to say, I agree with that. On the hiring, on the issue of sort of what to do about this, the cyclical phenomenon, I've written in other work that I think we should have a kind of a hiring credit policy in place. It's sort of like long-term UI that turns on basically as an automatic stabilizer. I was in California, very involved with policymakers when the recession hit, and they talked about a hiring credit, and finally did something at least 2 years too late. And I have evidence that says these countercyclical hiring credits actually do work, but we don't really do that. Again, at the federal level, we did it as sort of an add-on to the ARA, but not just something that kicks in automatically, and it can kick in quickly, pretty easy to administer, and it of course offsets this. It sort of works counter to the long-term unemployment problem, right? Because it encourages you to get back to work or encourages people to hire you at any rate.
Thank you. All right, so I don't want to eat into the next panelist time, so please join me in thanking our panelists.
Great to see you. You seem like you're doing well.
Thank you.
All right, are the microphones on now?
Anybody hear this? Oh yeah, there we go. Okay. Thanks very much, and welcome back to the second panel of this morning's program. I'll say that one thing I've certainly learned over the last year working with the Aspen Group is that there is just no debate about the significance of human capital in terms of raising both the potential and the actual improvement in working lives for Americans. But sort of asserting that human capital is important is one thing, but actually deciding what you do about it is another thing entirely. And one thing we've certainly learned in the last year and over, in fact, like many years, is that there's a wide variety of solutions and a big debate about the best way to go about that. I mean, do you start over, like you do tear up everything you have and start over anew with something new, or do you take what you already have and do you fix it? I think one way of the panel we have here is to discuss a specific proposal about taking the existing community college system and better targeting it towards outcomes. Now, one thing I do want to assert here is that there's good evidence to suggest there's a lot of potential in the community college system. Most of us are aware of the college premium in terms of like how it improves income for people who graduate from four-year colleges. What's lesser known is that is also true for people who graduate from two-year colleges with associate's degrees. Ann Stevens, who's not here, but who wrote one of the background papers in your volume, I strongly recommend it to you, has collected together a lot of empirical evidence that suggests that you get improvements of anywhere from 14 to 30% in earnings from a specific career and technical educational programs. But that's only part of the story, because the story also tells us that the results are not the same for all types of programs. They're not the same for all types of demographic groups. And so figuring out how you map your inputs in terms of resources to your outputs is a big part of the challenge. And that's what today's panel will be exploring. We have actually just a terrific group of people I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the last year, some of whom I've known for a long time. We'll start with Glenn Hubbard to my immediate right. He's the Dean of the Columbia Business School. He was also Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for George W. Bush. His co-author is Austin Goolsbee. He teaches economics at the University of Chicago. He was Chairman of Barack Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. Next to him is Penny Pritzker. She's a founder of PSP Partners, a private investment firm. She also spent 4 years as Commerce Secretary for Barack Obama and has written probably more studies on human capital than we've ever read. Next to her is Juan Salgado, who is a real practitioner. He is Chancellor of the City Colleges of Chicago, basically overseeing the education of 80,000 students over 7 colleges. And to his right, we're pleased to have Chris Liddell, who is the Deputy Chief of Staff in the Trump administration, especially for policy coordination. Before that, he was Chief Financial Officer for General Motors. Glenn and Austin, we'll start with you. Let's hear about the proposal.
Sure, and again, I'd like to join the chorus of thanks to Hank and Erskine for setting all of this up. There's a huge topic, obviously, about supporting work, but part of it is preparedness. And so the group project we were engaged in was trying to look at the intersection of what works and what's doable in the present political environment, and it's specifically about a proposal for supply-side investment in community colleges. Greg already mentioned the idea of a premium. It's a big number. If you complete college, and complete is an important part of this tale, wages are about 65% higher over your lifetime than for those with only a high school diploma. the country has done relatively well in increasing the share of students going to college, but the data on earnings outcomes are about completing college, and there we've done less well. About half of college-bound students fail to complete a degree within 6 years, even more so at public institutions than selected private institutions. And that same problem has been endemic to community colleges too. Community colleges play a huge role in the system for training people in practical skills. They also train the bulk of economically disadvantaged students. 44% of community college students come from families making less than $25,000 a year. And increasingly, there's a huge need among non-college bound students to build skills, the credential movement, the CTE studies to which Greg referred. What's our idea? I want to give an idea and a frame. The opportunity is, again, that college degrees pathway to economic opportunity is there. The big idea is a federal grant program to provide new funding to community colleges conditional on educational outcomes and institutional outcomes. And the frame is really something like a 21st century moral land grant program. I know people think big ideas can't be done. Well, I would remind everybody the Morrill Act was passed and enacted during the Civil War, arguably a challenging time. So I think we can do this. And the idea would be to make the federal grant program contingent on institutional outcomes. The goal. We want to increase the supply of college education workers. This is a supply side program. Always delighted to have Austin with me on the supply side. It is going to respond to unmet needs and unmet demand for mid-career skill development. The proposal we outline in our chapter also lays out some ideas we won't talk about today unless you ask about them on public-private training partnerships, data issues, and the reform of the Pell Grant. One twist here that's really important when I call this supply side incentive, this is directed to colleges, to community colleges, as opposed to tuition aid. So currently there's a debate in the body politic, the free tuition debate. We are on the supply side of that debate. Our focus would be on institutional outcomes and measurements. Specifically, we're trying to do two things. One is close the completion gap between 2- and 4-year schools. To do that, that would be taking the community college completion rate from something like 37.5% up to 60%. We're trying to target to do that by 2030 for those of you who are budgeteers. And that would bring about 3.6 million new 18 to 24-year-olds with better credentials. The second goal is to actually match the workforce with skills. So if you look in the year 2030, about 65% of working Americans, so we're talking about that as 25 to 64, would need a high quality credential, community college, or some equivalent credential. So we'd like to increase the share of Americans having that to 65% by 2030. That would affect 28 million Americans. So I'll turn it over to Austin to tell you how it all works.
Okay, a couple of points. Now, we actually have there's three of us authored this paper. Amy Gans, who you met this morning, is our other
so all the hard questions.
Co-author. Yeah, we're gonna pass to her. I was just gonna talk about three things. The first is why take a supply side approach rather than make college free, let's have debt-free college, or more aim at the students. And our view first is that the evidence is pretty strong, as Greg alluded to, that the existing community college system is actually quite effective at raising earnings and establishing either new to career or people changing careers. It has been quite affordable. The average tuition to the students is around $3,500 a year. And yet, at the same time, the returns are as high as they've ever been. The community colleges are starved for resources, and over the last 10 years, the support that the states have given to their community college systems has really been squeezed more and more, and that has forced the community colleges to up the tuition and fees so that now the tuition and fees are a higher share of the spending than they've ever been. The federal government has tried through Pell Grants and others to fill some of the gap, but it hasn't done so. So at the same time, the demand benefits have never been higher. The supply has never been tighter. And the evidence, in addition to the payoffs to people's wages, the question of does increasing the resources to the schools improve the performance of the students? There are a number of papers, some of which are random controlled trials, which show quite convincingly that as you increase the resources to the community colleges, the better the outcomes are for the students who are going there. And that's not all, some of those are targeted programs, and we talk about in the paper career advice, academic coaching, curricular advice, just to explain to people, look, you actually have enough credits. If you just take 2 more classes, you can complete your associate's degree, or making it easy for people to transfer once they get an associate's degree to a 4-year college if they want to continue. We have a number of areas in which we highlight institutional resources could improve the completion rate, and the data suggests that it has done that. And then the second thing is a major focus of our paper, and a major focus for the Council on Foreign Relations and others, has been the recognition that the world of skills and training cannot just be restricted to people that are 25 years old and less. So we need to target adults, and community colleges are one of the only institutions that have shown effectiveness in the retraining or upskilling of adult learners for career and technical education. You will see the members of our group are a diverse, they have diverse backgrounds, they are of diverse political parties. We found we could agree on accountability being an important aspect, that if you're going to fund the schools on the supply side to try to avoid the problem of if you just hand all money to demand, it might drive up the tuition and drive up the costs of the limited resource. We want the funding to the schools to be dependent on things like what are the completion rates, as well as what are the student characteristics, what are the local labor market conditions, and how the performance is going. In an effort not to avoid the schools from simply cream skimming and say, well, if you're going to give us more funding for having people graduate, we're just not going to take anyone that's at risk of not graduating. That would really quite defeat the purpose. So in the funding formula, we wanted to take into account inputs as well as outputs, let's call it. And we want to, mindful of some of the experiences in states of the recession, we want to require that they maintain or increase the funding of the system they have now, not if this program increases funding, then they say, okay, well then we can take away the funding for what I already did and spend it on something else. Our cost estimate is really 2 parts of almost equal size. One is a series of investments to increase the completion rate or transfer to 4-year college rate at community colleges for people age 18 to 24. That one's about $12 billion. And then raising the either high quality credential or graduation rate for adults 25 to 64, that's about $10 billion. So together we say $22 billion. To put in some perspective, the free tuition plans are about $50 billion. The debt-free college plans are about $85 billion. So our view was, before trying to reinvent the wheel or create something new, let's collectively target something that we know has been working, is cost effective, and is getting choked off for various reasons, and that's how we got where we are.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Austin. Penny, I'd like to turn to you now. You've spent a lot of time, a lot of years thinking about both U.S. competitiveness and the skills gap. Can you tell us about how you think U.S. career technical education system is holding back the U.S.'s competitiveness? And what's your take on how this proposal would target the unmet needs that you've identified?
Well, as you said, I'm passionate about this issue of workforce training, and it's only more and more the evidence is showing as artificial intelligence and automation are changing the nature of work. We have to help Americans adapt and thrive in this economy. And, Americans are nervous. We know this. Pew has told us this. Edelman, you look at study after study. And so I view this as the economic issue of our time. The question is, why are community colleges critical and vital to a systems change? That's really, in my mind, a fundamental issue that this group has undertaken. And if you look at community colleges, they're a gateway to a four-year college. If you look at a third of Americans who begin their ability to get through four-year colleges, they begin at community colleges. 3/4 of those students are low income. And one of the issues that I know Hank raised earlier and Erskine is this whole question of, we're leaving too many Americans behind. And so this is a vital, demonstrated organizations, community colleges, that can deliver. And we know that 2/3 of community college students are economically disadvantaged. Only 10% today are over the age of 40. That we need to improve, and that's part of what we're calling for, is to make the community colleges a place where someone who needs retraining feels really comfortable going and knows that the credentials that they're going to get are valuable. So how does this fit into competitiveness, and why do I think that community colleges are so incredibly important? Is because they're a critical link between the business community and the worker. And they're closest to the ground, which is really critical. I think it's very hard, sort of from a national policy, except from the standpoint of financing, to decide what do you need in Chicago versus what do you need in Wichita. If you look at Chicago, the industries that are most important to us are things like healthcare and hospitality and logistics. If you look at Wichita, it's aviation, right? And so those communities, each of those communities have found a way, and you'll hear from Rahm Emanuel, later, but each community has found a way, or one, to connect its community colleges with its most important industries and sectors. And that's really important for competitiveness, because at the end of the day, the skills that are needed as technology is changing are evolving. And what a student or a reskilling worker needs to know is, if I go and take that course, am I going to be better off in my work life? Is this going to lead me to a higher income? Is this going to help my career? Is that credential valuable to me? And what we've seen in Chicago, and Juan will talk about this, whether it's the Apprenticeship 2020 program, or it's the tech boot camps, or it's the programs that we're doing around logistics or other areas of our economy, Juan has the schools that are most closely able to work with the local business community to say, here's what I need in this area. And that's true around the country. You see it in Wichita. They absolutely built technical schools to service the aviation industry. The aviation industry in Wichita is 1 in every 5 jobs. And so, and the credentials that you get, there's a massive number of them, are all valued by the employers in that community. So this kind of flexibility, this ability to work on the ground in a community is really critical. What I like about the proposal that we've made is, and how it enhances competitiveness, it's really not saying, here's a solution. It's saying, what we need to do is take under-resourced assets, which our community colleges have been, their resources are under pressure. State budgets are under pressure, and the federal government has not kept up. We need to take these very effective resources, using the evidence that we've got, give them more juice so that they can help our American workforce be more competitive and productive in the opportunities that exist in those communities.
Thanks very much, Penny. Juan, you're here because you're the practitioner. You actually are there on the front lines trying to figure out how to match resources to needs. Tell us about what are the strains and the stresses you face trying to serve the needs of this community of students, and how is this proposal, in your view, is it an improvement over what you have today?
Yeah, let me just say that when I think about the proposal, I think about specifically what's occurred in the state of Illinois over the last 3 or 4 years. We've seen an over 33% decline in state resources to higher education, which we've also seen at the community college level. We've seen a year where we didn't have a state budget for most of the year. And despite that, what I face daily is what my students face daily. On a daily basis, I have students that are coming to class that are also hungry. Food insecurity in community colleges at a record high. I have students that have not 1 but 2 jobs, balance that with their studies, along with being parents themselves, right, at the same time. So the time that they have to actually parent and care for the next generation, severely limited. Students that come from geographies in Chicago. While we have a booming economy, we have neighborhoods in Chicago with 48% of the people living there, the young people, 24 to working age adults that are out of school, out of work. We have those are African American neighborhoods. We have Latino neighborhoods with 30% out of school, men out of school and out of work. And so we have a confluence of students that are coming with trauma that has occurred in their lives for a variety of reasons. And yet students that are, 75% of our students still have to take a developmental education class, whether it's a math class or an English class. And so we are faced with figuring out how to properly support those students with fewer resources. And at the same time, be incredibly responsive to business. Because if we're not incredibly responsive to business, these students won't have the competitive edge. They don't have the networks. They don't have the experience base. There's not someone in their life that has exposed them to economic opportunity. That's why institutions like ours are bridge connectors. We're open the doors to students, to the private sector, to economic opportunity. And so when I look at that proposal, it offers community colleges the opportunity for creativity and innovation, along with accountability. In Chicago, we've made great strides. We went from a 7% graduation rate to now over 24%. And we've doubled the number of students that have transferred, that complete and transfer onto 4-year institutions. We've doubled the number of students that actually get credentials of economic value, including their associate's degree. As a system, we've done this because we've been incentivized by what I would call Chicago pride, and a mayor that's been relentless, and you'll hear from him a little while ago, in making sure that what we do at our college is tied to the growing areas of our economy, period. And so that means you have to change institutionally, and that's hard to do, right? And so I see the proposal also as an opportunity to create an avenue where community colleges get incentivized to drop that course offering that's no longer in demand and add the one that is, and to create responsive efforts to adults. Right now, there is not a funding mechanism really that works in the United States of America for adults trying to return to work. You talked about career and technical education. How are we funding, by and large, our career and technical education? It's through philanthropy and through trying to scratch and claw it all together, okay? The boot camps that Penny talked about, we put up some cybersecurity boot camps that are intended to get people to come back into the workforce and get into high demand jobs. It's actually through Penny's foundation that we got that done. Why? Because the systems don't work that way. And you look at ITAs and the workforce board, well, the level of paperwork required and the limited amount of those ITAs create a system that really at the end of the day doesn't work. So we need some flexible dollars to be able to move quickly to meet that overall demand. And one of the things I love about it, by the way, and look, it has accountability built in. You all have said that we've got a window till 2030 for this to work Otherwise, it goes away. And I think that's important too, because community colleges can't just see this as a new source of revenue. They have to see this as seed funding to make change happen that will truly impact their students.
Well, thanks very much. Chris, I'd like to turn to you now. Obviously, tell us about what the administration's approach to workforce development issues is. I know there's been a lot of emphasis on apprenticeships, for example. Is the administration's approach complementary to or competitive with what you're hearing today? Is there overlap?
Sure, and firstly, thanks to Aspen Institute for doing this. It's incredibly important. Let me give you a little bit of context, and then I'll drill down on the specific issue at hand. In terms of context, other than my general role for policy coordination across the whole of the White House, the two areas that I'm most interested in are how America wins in the industries of the future and how we have workforce training. And those two are obviously linked with each other. When I start with industries of the future, I think it's critical for our country from a national security point of view, from a prosperity point of view, and from a social point of view, that we win in the industries of artificial intelligence, 5G, advanced manufacturing, synthetic biology, and quantum computing. And as you've seen from a lot of the literature, not all jobs are going to go away, but all jobs to a large extent are going to be impacted to a certain extent by those industries. So in order to win in those industries, we need to have the people to do it. And you've already seen that we have 6 million job openings in the country. We have 6 million unemployed people, but we don't have people with the right skills. That's only going to get worse in the future. So clearly this is a critical issue. It's not only critical from an economic point of view, it's critical from a social point of view. And I think we have to look at the whole system in total. So I'll make a couple of comments, but then I'll drill down into the role of community colleges inside the system. I was struck by something that Oren Cass wrote a little while ago that some of you might have seen, which is basically at the current system, a fifth of people drop out of high school, a fifth of people graduate from high school but go straight into the workforce. A fifth of people go to college but drop out of college. A fifth of people go to college, graduate, but then get a job that doesn't actually need what they just graduated with. And only a fifth of people basically go through the system as it is, which is go to high school, go to college, graduate, and get a job that relates to what they just graduated from. So the system, which made a lot of sense 100 years ago, doesn't actually make any sense anymore. So we need to address the system overall. And as I think you said in your paper, there's no single bullet to that. In terms of the way the administration's looking at it and the way I think about it, we set up something called the National Council for the American Worker 6 months ago, which brings together all of the senior people inside the agencies and also inside the White House to address it with three basic objectives. One, obviously, we want to coordinate our policy and resources, and I'll come back to that specifically as it addresses these issues. The second is we want to work with the private sector, so we're going to announce in the next couple of weeks a fantastic group of pretty much the leading CEOs and some of the college administrators to think about public-private partnerships and the role of that. And I know some of the work Penny and others have done building on that, which has been fantastic. And the third, to be honest, is changing perception. A lot of this is about this mentality that the four-year college is the only way that you're actually going to succeed in life. For some percentage of people, that's true. For a lot of people, that's not true. Lifelong learning is going to be much more important, and community colleges have an incredibly important role. So in terms of the policy settings, coming back to that aspect of it, you skipped over the ancillary recommendations, but in fact, I would have started there and then gone to the area, because I think there's an incredible power in that, and there's a high degree of alignment between what you suggested and what I think we as an administration believe in. So reforming the Pell Grant system is obviously on that list. Currently, it's inflexible. It doesn't actually apply to short-term, more flexible programs. If we brought that in, it would allow in particular some of the mature students that you're talking about who have left and want to come back into the industry to actually get the skills that they need rather than having to go through the whole 2 years. So Pell Grant is definitely one. Accreditation, we need a different accreditation system to think about outcomes, not inputs. You relate to that a bit with your suggestions. New partnerships, so community colleges can't do it all on their own. They need to think about partnerships with non-traditional providers, whether they be online, boot camps or whatever, that relates to the Pell Grant and the accreditation. There's no point in putting those partnerships in if you can't get the funding or can't get the actual
credentials associated with it. New public-private partnerships, you mentioned apprenticeships, that's something we obviously believe in, the previous administration believed in, put a lot of effort into. You've probably seen the statistics, we have like 100,000 apprenticeships a year, roughly, virtually all of which are in the construction sector. If we just, most people think about Germany when they think about apprenticeships. If you just think about Britain or Canada or some of the other countries that maybe look a little bit more like us from a workforce point of view, if we had the same number of apprenticeships as them, we'd have over 1 million. So it's a vast source of opportunity, and when you think about what people are giving up in order to come into training, obviously earn and learn type structures make a lot more sense. So a lot of fantastic things happening already in the public-private partnership. That's something that through this council and through all the associated works makes a lot of sense. And then data, which is another one of the areas that you had. We think the power of data in this area is phenomenal. It's one of the least, along with healthcare, one of the least well-dated area. So having a data schema that basically connects employers, employees, training organizations in a systematic way. The amount of data that we have at the moment is primitive. It doesn't really give any of those people what they need in order to produce the courses of the future, for employees to figure out what the right courses are and what their returns are, to get employers connected with those people. So a lot of work we're going on. This is not something the government is going to own, but we want to facilitate the private sector moving to a much more powerful use of data in the workforce, and we think that will enable it. So those are the sort of areas which pretty much are all in your paper, which we fundamentally aligned with. A lot of those we can do by regulation, but not to a significant extent. Most of the things I just talked about will require legislative change. I was chatting just beforehand. This is an area which I think at least you can be optimistic because there's a reasonable amount of bipartisan agreement. So if we're able to get the Higher Education Act passed again in the next 18 months, then I think this is an area, those areas that I talked about, at least there are fertile grounds for that. On the who pays for it, coming to that, in my experience, I'm Chief Financial Officer by background. In my experience, virtually nothing in the government is we underspend in. This is an area perhaps in the community college area we look at, but we spend something like $160 billion on higher education at the moment. We spend another $20 billion on workforce training programs. There's 47 workforce training programs that make up that $20 billion. A lot of that doesn't probably make sense. So to the first place I would look would probably be on where we currently spend before I spent more money. But interestingly, if you solve some of the other problems, which is why I started there, if you have a short-term program, you don't need 2 years of funding. You might only need 6 months of funding or whatever the program is. And obviously, if you stop people from dropping out, and I was staggered by the figures of community colleges, I think it's like 40% graduation rate on. If you stop people from falling out, dropping out, and they qualify for a Pell Grant or a loan, then by definition the funding is going to go up, because that's not a finite resource that goes with the employee. So actually you would increase funding just by solving some of the other problems. And by having things like apprenticeships and earn for learn, you can bring more funding in from non-federal. So I think it's a fantastic initiative. I think it's got a lot of merit in not just the core, but all the things around it, and certainly to a large extent aligned with what we're doing.
Terrific, thanks. I'd like to drill down on the funding formula for your proposal, Glenn and Austin, which I think is one of the most intriguing innovations here. So to recap, your formula would basically look at the types of kids that the colleges are taking in. You get more money if they're more difficult kids. You know, they come from a worse background. And it's also linked to outcomes, you know, better outcomes, more money. Juan, I'd like to ask you, how do you feel about that formula? That's obviously going to put constraints on what you can do. Do you like the idea of having the federal funds you get geared to those types of inputs and outputs?
I don't just like it, I love it. Okay, I love it because the current system is the opposite in many respects. The current system actually provides fewer resources for those students that you might say need it the most, right? And because of the way we tax locally, right? and other factors. And so, what this does is ensure, right, that colleges are focused on those students. And the way you focus on them, by the way, is, and Austin talked a little about this, is by reaching out to them and bringing them in, right? And so if there's not an incentive structure that says bring them in, then what you're going to get is folks targeting the outcomes and the outcomes only. And we're going to start to limit access. We should be broadening access. The only way to get to the economic goals that we have as a country is to make sure that these communities and these populations of students are fully included, fully supported, and that they reach the outcomes that we would want our children to reach as well. So I love it.
Glenn or Austin, could one of you speak to why you moved in that direction? And one of the contexts here is that the Obama administration introduced something called the Gainful Employment Rule, which basically conditioned eligibility for federal loan aid on the outcomes of those colleges. This created a lot of controversy. I believe the current administration has not been very favorable towards it, partly because the for-profit college sector was disproportionately affected by it. So why did you hit upon this formula, and how do you deal with some of the criticisms that were raised about the Obama administration's approach?
Well, I think we started just from the perspective that completion was the problem we were trying to solve, that community colleges were an entity that seemed to be working in delivering those things, so we tried to marry those two. And then the question is, how do you stop the cream skimming that Austin referred to? Because that's bad. If you just throw money at community colleges and say, take the best kids, well, then we haven't really solved the problem. So it was really thinking about it no harder than that. Completion, community colleges work, and how do you solve the cream skimming? We would hope, I think, as a working group, that this is fundable. I mean, Chris is absolutely right. We spent a lot on workforce training. Part of the problem is the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act is a different budget animal than workforce. I mean, it's all hard, but in principle, this should be doable.
Yeah, and I guess I would say it in two parts. Let's hold the gainful employment discussion for 1 second. In the previous panel, you heard the rural versus urban conflict. Community colleges are both, A, they're working, and B, they're everywhere. They're in places. So if you go, my parents are retired in Abilene, Texas. Well, there's junior colleges. There's community colleges there. This is not a thing where we're inventing new institutions or we have to encourage everybody pick up from where you are and go to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and go to the University of Michigan, and then go to a city, move to Chicago, and you never go back to where you were. The evidence that the institutions are there and working was kind of central, and we wanted to, if you want to increase completion, you got to kind of go to the margin. Where are people dropping out? And the cream skimming margin is problematic on that front if you just look at outcomes, not inputs. Now, on gainful employment, I know a lot about that. That was first coming in when I was in the Obama administration. That was only applied to for-profits. Okay, so that was only about for-profit education, and it said if the job that you're going to take will not pay enough to pay back the loans on average, then your students can't qualify for federal grants. Now, I think that's a totally reasonable idea, and the area of for-profit education, as anybody knows who starts looking at, is full of a bunch of, I won't say bad actors, but there are very problematic circumstances where people are entering culinary programs that are charging them $35,000 a year, and the average salary when they're graduating is $25,000 a year. And so how are they going to ever pay back the loans? By the measures of gainful employment. One of the controversies was, well, why don't you apply those to private schools, and could a Harvard philosophy major satisfy the gainful employment rule? Now, actually, they probably could, no matter what their major was. But community colleges look amazing by any of these standards. Community colleges charge $3,500 a year. And so there is no criteria, there's no gainful employment criteria that community colleges will fail. And that's kind of the thing that motivated us of, what are we doing? This is the most cost-effective form of documentedly good skills, and we're squeezing them for resources at exactly the moment when if you were going to expand, that's what you would expand.
So if I could clarify, so outcomes are one of the criteria about how much funding an institution gets, right? Are those the outcomes of that institution, or is it a broader sort of like coast to coast type of criteria? And the reason I ask is because I can imagine one, like for example, your formula essentially says the outcomes of a previous cohort will determine how much money you get for this cohort. But you might say, that cohort we took in 4 years ago, that was a particularly difficult cohort, you know, for the following circumstances. You're basically punishing us because we took in some tough kids 4 years ago.
But the trends are fairly steady. And I think that I mean, in most geographies, like our system, you know, the number of Pell eligible, the number of students that are in need of certain assistance, if you created incentives for us to go out and get more students like that. I'll give you an example. We created a partnership with the Chicago Housing Authority, specific supports to Housing Authority residents so that they can achieve at higher rates. And guess what happened? They did, right? Chicago Housing Authority residents are now graduating at higher percentages than a normal student coming in that's not a CHA resident because they got a little extra support that CHA is providing in-house. And so, you know, but let's create an incentive so that we go out, not just them, by the way, diverse learners. Our universities, by and large, don't take diverse learners, and our high schools are full of diverse learners. What are we doing to help our diverse learners? And so by creating these input incentives, along with the output incentives, you create a whole system that I think is more in line with our values as a nation than what we have right now.
But you're right, we are doing it at the level of the institution.
Okay, yeah.
So that,
Yeah,
just to be clear.
I don't know what the alternative. I mean,
I don't know how
you got to base it on the data that they had,
Okay.
and if 2 years before they had a tough, you know, nobody graduated or you know they didn't complete. We got to.
And to this funding issue, you know, Juan mentioned the squeezing earlier. You know, we found in the papers 75 cents on the dollar, community college to four-year state school, and that's getting worse and worse. I mean, we're squeezing the very institution that actually works.
Thanks. In a few minutes, we'll have some time, I hope, for some questions from you all. If you do have a question, please write it down on a note card and then pass it to a person who will pick it up in the aisle and bring it to me. But a few more questions. We haven't talked much about apprenticeships, but clearly that is one of the alternative approaches to like improving career technical education. Glenn or Austin, could one of you just briefly explain why you went in this direction? And then Penny, I'd like your thoughts on apprenticeship versus community college.
We did in our ancillary programs. We do talk about apprenticeships. It's not that we're opposed to apprenticeships, especially if done in public-private partnership. The one thing to remember is that the average apprenticeship costs something like $30,000 a year. And so in a world in which you can get a community college education and vocational skill training for 1/8, 1/10 the price, that's why we made this our priority.
Penny?
So
Although you do have an expert right there who's disagreeing with you, but that's
our experience is that the community colleges are essential to apprenticeships. And what we've seen is that particularly as we're evolving apprenticeships in our city to be more white-collar apprenticeships in addition to the construction apprenticeships and others, that the community colleges, and frankly, we also need the mentoring organizations who are helping, you know, the support organizations. We have to combine them with the community college to help the young person be ready for the apprenticeship. What we're seeing is an explosion of apprenticeships because they're working for the employer. But they're not possible without the community college. It's not like you just go out and as an employer and say, please come to apply for my apprenticeship. The community colleges have become essential in qualifying students, in providing the education that's complementary to the apprenticeship, in partnering with the organizations that are providing social service and mentoring services to the young people, so that when they're showing up at the apprenticeship, they're job ready, if you will. And we're seeing our CEOs are thrilled with the outcomes. And we've gone, I think, from 50 white collar to 400 this year, and we're going to be at 500 or 600 next year. And I think we can, you know, our goal is 10,000.
I mean, it raises a one point of, let's call it economic theory, which is as the job market has evolved from you get one job and you stay in that job for your whole life, the incentives of employers to invest in what the economists would consider basic skills has gone way down. So now if you look in the data, the average person now has had 14 different jobs by age 48. Okay, in a world where you got 14 jobs by age 48, no one of those 14 employers wants to pay for stuff that I'm going to pay to educate you basic skills that you're going to then go take to somebody else. So the community college can play into the apprenticeship.
And what Juan has had to do is partner with the private, with philanthropy to try and cobble together the support structure as well as extra resources in the community college to be able to create this pipeline that's having massive success. This is where an incentive, a federal incentive, would be so effective to outcomes driven, but basically gives someone, Juan and his peers around the country the opportunity to create, to be innovative, to meet this demand and need.
Yeah, so I totally agree. Penny, I see community colleges as being fundamental to the whole apprenticeship program. So again, it's redefining what apprenticeships mean with a much more broad thought. We think about them in the very traditional sense. This is a 16-year-old kid who wants to go into welding or whatever. We are talking potentially about a 35-year-old person who wants retraining. And it could be in white collar, it could be in the industries of the future. It doesn't have to be in traditional sort of blue collar jobs. So if you think of earn and learn as opposed to apprenticeship is really a subset of that. And community colleges are fundamental, and for all the reasons that Austin was saying before, they have the breadth, they have the local knowledge, they have the connection with businesses in the local communities. So they are the perfect people to deliver the programs necessary. All we need to do is redefine and give them the flexibility to do that.
And just so we in Chicago set a goal, 50% of our completers will have an earn and learn opportunity before they graduate. Traditionally, those kinds of opportunities are thought of for students in their junior and senior year. We believe that to reach the adults and the young people coming into our system, doing it in freshman, sophomore year, doing it earlier on, it's going to be helpful.
Thanks. I'll turn to a few questions here. Now, this is, I think, is a very good question. Unfortunately, he or she's using some acronyms that hopefully you can fill in for me as I go along. With outcomes funding for colleges based on completion, the fastest and least expensive degrees to produce at a community college are AA and AS degrees. AA stands for?
Associate of Arts.
And AS is
Associate of Science.
Thank you. We know these don't have the labor market returns we see in more expensive AAS degrees. AAS is?
Associate of Arts Science.
Is that right? Is that right? Okay. Have you considered?
That was a new one on me.
Have you considered all associate's degrees are not created equal? How do you account for that differentiation in your funding model? The possibility that there are certain degrees that are a better investment than others.
Well, in some sense, that's going to be linked to an outcomes measure, because how well people are ultimately doing in the labor market, to the extent that that statement is true, that should be in the data. If you have
Yeah, look, my only, the most optimistic thing about labor force training policy is that it doesn't just rely on some person at the Department of Labor to figure out what the jobs of the future will be and what training everybody has. Everybody who's going out to community colleges, absolutely, and if you look at Chicago city colleges or any others, the students, they want to know, well, wait a minute, what is it and where do they go? What can I take and what can I use it? So if they are short programs, certificate programs, let's say, that aren't going to have as big of a bang for the buck, I think they may have some harder time to recruiting.
I think it's the wrong choice. I don't think you're comparing one degree to another. I think you should think of the whole menu. So you should be comparing it to a 6-week boot camp, a blended online, offline course that might take a year, of which the two degrees that you just mentioned are just two choices of 10, not one versus the other.
And I think we're missing the concept of stackable credentials as well. Okay. Which is key here. I mean, in most community colleges in our system, there's not any coursework that you're taking that doesn't stack into the next set of courses that stacks into an associate's degree and a 4-year degree. And so I think that we've got to build into the proposal the concept of stackable credentials.
Juan, I remember, I think it was you that told me this, that one of the problems you face is that some of the degrees that are most in demand and have the best outcomes, like nursing, like IT, are also the most expensive for you to offer. They require a lot of facilities and so forth, you know? So that creates a real kind of like almost a contradiction between need, demand, and supply. How do you get around that? And does this formula address that?
We just opened a $45 million Center for Advanced Manufacturing and Engineering. You see the equipment that we have there. You can only put, you know, so many students on that piece of equipment. So you're exactly right. Again, I think that those programs are going to result in higher income. And here's or more steady income. It can't always just be, you know, how high is your income? There's also a question of how steady is that over time. Let me just say that, you know, the way we're collecting data is very problematic for community colleges. Graduation rates don't tell our story. Income growth does. And we've got to find an easy way for us to be able to tell ourselves and our students, here are the programs where your income's going to grow in this direction and that direction because of the data showing us that. We don't have that by and large in our community college system as a whole.
The following question is actually my sort of like incorporation of a few ideas I've got here, but it's one I've thought about a lot, which is the distinction between soft skills and hard skills. So a lot of the things that employers raise isn't just whether or not the graduate has the hard skills necessary to do this specific occupation, but the soft skills, the communicative, the ability to communicate, the attendance, the sort of like creative problem solving and so forth. Glenn or Austin, could one of you talk about whether your proposal specifically addresses that? And in particular, I'm intrigued by the emphasis you give to increasing funding for in-course support to help kids finish the degree as opposed to the actual provision of the degree. Why did you come to that conclusion? And I'd like to hear if any of the other panelists have views on whether support for soft skills needs to be part of the solution.
It's very important, and we weren't trying to say that this is only about so-called hard skills and not soft skills. The resilience, the attendance, all those are soft skills, but some of these things Austin referred to are very important. The data show people often drop out for very small expenditures. You know, the idea of mentioned the student that's working and has children and suddenly has to drop out for lack of $500. There's small interventions that can keep students engaged that then build that resilience and soft skills.
Yeah, and one of them was career counseling and career mentors. So we definitely had that in mind. Now, it's still always going to be the case that it's hard to teach communication. It's hard to teach EQ. To some people, it's harder than other people to teach, you know, those skills.
It's hard to teach some MBAs EQ.
That's what I'm saying. Professors are the lowest on the.
But funding for this kind of support really doesn't exist institutionally.
Yes.
Really, what's happening is more and more of it's being done by philanthropy, and that's not sustainable. I think philanthropy can be like the venture capital. It can show the system how it can work, but at some point we need to acknowledge you need either, you know, whether it's career counselors or it's also, I mean, we see it with the DACA kids that we're putting through school. You know, they're persisting at a 70% rate through college, 4-year college in 4 years. But we've also got folks at you know, they're in 20 schools in Illinois. And we've got someone in each of those schools that is a resource for them so that, as Austin said, the $500 problem doesn't become the reason they drop out of school. And you see the same in the apprenticeship program that we're doing, which is these kids need some wraparound services, not huge, but enough that there's a resource for them to go to when they hit a skid.
Take any young person and put them in a corporate environment that's new to them. Take one of our students that has never really been in a downtown office building, you know, let alone in the corporate suite. They're going to need some supports. I believe the soft skills discussion is a discussion about access and opportunity. You know, that we have soft skills because we've been exposed to environments and coached along the way through many, many years. Our students all should benefit from that coaching. And so, you know, it's getting that career coaches in the colleges, and it's getting the earn and learn opportunities in the real workplaces.
One initiative is not the solution, but certainly helps is credentialing and certification. And there's some interesting initiatives going on there, mainly driven out of the private sector, but we need the private sector to recognize credentialing in a much more systematic and broad-based fashion. You can certify
some of these skills, whether it's analytical problem solving or teamwork or whatever. At the moment, you just don't have a common understanding of what that means, and you don't have an acceptance by the private sector that that's something that they will recruit against. So most of the recruiting, it comes down to some extent data, to some extent it's perception. They'll recruit against, I need a degree in this, but what they should be looking for is the following sets of skills certified by an institution that actually teaches them.
But we've heard, like for as recently as the first panel, how occupational licensing has become a barrier to mobility. How do we prevent credentialing from becoming just another form of occupational licensing that erects artificial barriers to mobility?
I think the credentialing should be owned by the people who employ the people. So the credentialing should be industry driven. It is to some extent already, but there's something like, I don't know what the figure is, 8,000 credentials. So you need industries to come together and say, we will actually certify the credential holders and the nature of the credentials and get it much more systematic. Then you actually need employers to employ against it and training institutions to train against it as well. So it's happening, but it's still embryonic.
We have just a few minutes left. Let's sort of like turn to the easiest question of all, which is about funding and money. So a question here, what do you think of the idea of tax incentives for corporations who to spend on mentoring, internships, apprenticeships, any of this training? Any thoughts on the panel?
I think it's the opposite. You should incent corporations to take in take in apprenticeships and provide internships, not to tax them for doing
No, this is
it.
the opposite.
He's saying
tax incentives for it. Should there be tax incentives to do that?
Yes.
Yes.
There should be. I mean, I think we need to prove out pipeline, right? The construction of local pipelines, and then you want to explode the opportunities so that smaller corporations can provide the same opportunities, and that's what we're trying to do in Chicago is be the pilot. Aon and Accenture have been really the funding source for bringing together a consortium of, 20 plus employers now. But ultimately, we need apprenticeships in a box, and we need a pipeline that is durable through the community colleges with the social service supports.
I would say yes to all of that, but I would go back to Austin's basic econ point. The problem is you do have a free rider problem in training, because if I train people, they just go to work for a penny. But you could solve the tax incentives, we have tax mechanisms to deal with that, but I think you'd want to do that in conjunction with the community college expansion. I think both together can be pretty powerful.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the reasons for success of our effort in Chicago is that the apprentices are a real business solution to those companies. And so I think that while you can have a tax incentive, it should be a little additive, but I think that there's real value in these earn and learn being real business value to those companies.
Okay, I think we're just a little bit past our time, but lightning round, I'm going to finish with this the easiest question of all. Yes or no, should we raise taxes to pay for this initiative? $22 billion a year?
If that were the only way to do it, I would do it. I would suggest spending cuts could account for much of it, along the lines Chris said, but yes, absolutely.
Austin?
Yes, we should.
But he always says that.
In our proposal, we talk a bit about the original land grant formulation, but with a very few exceptions, the land grants were not land to put the university on that land. They were, here's surplus property that the government has that we will give to you, you sell and you use the proceeds to establish the school. So
Penny.
I'm where Chris and Glenn are. I think there's opportunity to move money around to make this happen.
But we'll put Guam on the table if we have to.
Juan, should we raise taxes to pay for this initiative?
I think ultimately you're going to have to. I don't think you can wring as much as you think you're going to from the system as it is.
Chris?
I don't think the final ticket will be quite as high as what we've seen if we do it right, and I'd reallocate.
Thanks very much. Thanks for a very interesting discussion. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you could take your seats.
You can all hear me, right? Oh, sounds like yes. I'm Catherine Rampell. I'm an op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, where I mostly write about economic and public policy issues. And I'm delighted to be moderating this panel with our esteemed guests, President Mitch Daniels to my far right, who was previously, as I'm sure many of you know, the governor of Indiana, and can talk a little bit about his experience leading a state as well as leading a massive university system. And then to my closer right is, although politically
to Mitch's left.
Yeah, to Mitch's left, right? That's a better way of framing it.
Yeah, let's start with the point of origin. I still have 4 months left. I gotta survive.
Mayor Rahm Emanuel, who is the mayor of Chicago, and both of our panelists actually have experience in Washington as well. And we'll talk a little bit, I'd love to anyway, about the contrast from the view from DC versus on the ground at the state and local level. One thing that I think is interesting, and I'd like to talk about to frame this debate, is how there's, if not exactly consensus, some overlap between left and right when it comes to problem solving at the state and local level, in that on the left, well, I should say states and cities have been much more active in policymaking in the last several years rather, when it comes to trying to find creative ways to promote opportunity. Some of that is related to obstructionism and what have you in Washington, or inability to come to consensus. And some of that is just about a lot more energy at the state and local level. And on the left, you have what I think Mayor Emanuel has termed the new local liberalism. Is that the term that you have preferred? You're writing a book on this, correct?
Correct.
That there's been a lot of activity in terms of promoting higher minimum wages, paid sick leave, paid family leave, things like that that are more associated with the left. But you know, on the right wing, historically, there's been a conservative commitment to federalism, to you know, the federal policymakers deferring to what goes on at the state and local level. And so there is some, I think, again, overlap in on both left and right about letting the states and cities be the laboratories of democracy and try to find creative ways to solve these problems. So the first thing that I wanted to talk with the two of you about is how your perspective on what the barriers to economic opportunity has changed, if at all, from your time in DC versus at the state and local level. President Daniels.
I wish I could say it changed a lot. I mean, I thought the root causes were obvious. Even in when I served my first sentence in the federal government. They are in such large measure cultural, as opposed to economics, are susceptible to anybody's policy prescriptions. They've gotten progressively worse, which has meant the challenge and the need for imaginative approaches like the mayor has certainly exemplified have gotten larger. You know, I think it's, but it was a delusion even 10 and 20 and 30 years ago to think that Washington can do much about this other than to create macroeconomic conditions that give Americans wherever they live and at whatever station of life a better chance. That's when states and localities, I think, can be paddling upstream and downstream and not up.
Mayor.
I think, so two things I would say. One is we try to reduce, when I first became mayor, I asked McKinsey and Brookings Institute, I hope that doesn't get me in trouble here at Aspen, to come in and do a study, what was wrong in the last 10 years of right, and write us an economic and business plan for the next 10 years. And at that time, both economists as well as A.T. Kearney and IBM all came out with studies. Chicago was the second most competitive economy in North America and either 9th, 8th, or 7th worldwide. They all identified what I then have reduced to our 5, what I call T's. Talent, transportation, training, technology, transparency. So nearly 40% of the people in the city of Chicago have a college degree. It was 29% when I started. And we work hard at recruiting and retaining 4-year degrees. Juan just spoke about, we've now came up with the Chicago Star, which is free community college if you get a B average in a high school. Because I think there's major socioeconomic benefit from that. 81% of the kids that take it are the first ones in their family to go to college. And we've had over 6,000. And my view is in a time in which you earn what you learn, we got to make sure 14th grade is the new standard, not 12th. Second, I can talk about, there was a New York Times article the other day, what the MTA can learn from the Chicago Transit Authority. Our on-time arrival is 97%, just for all you DC public transportation people, with a satisfaction rate at 93%. I want you to know I felt really good when I told you that, okay? Airport, same thing, et cetera. What I would say on training goes principally to the community college system. I'm happy about our 4-year degree, nearly 40% of the people. But I want to make sure that when a company, since we're 5 years in a row, #1 for corporate relocations in America and #1 for direct foreign investment in America, that you can get Booth, you can get Kellogg, you can get U of I, you get a lot of Purdue graduates, et cetera, but I want to make sure when it comes to scouring the earth for talent, from Kennedy King to Booth School, we have every educational need you need. And if you have talent, you're going to win in the next 30 years, guaranteed. And then the last thing, which is a big piece of this, is you have to create certainty around the public sector from a finance standpoint. And we didn't have that. We do have it today. 5 T's: talent, training, technology, transportation, and transparency. And that's been the economic model. And I think you can conclude, so for 5 years in a row, #1 on corporate relocations, 6 years in a row, #1 on direct foreign investment. It's not because I have a winning, charming personality. It's because we have a good economic plan. We focus on it like a laser. And I actually believe that should be the strategy if you extrapolate it nationally. Invest in your infrastructure, invest in access to higher education, invest in R&D, and bring people in from around the world and create certainty around public finances. Those are the conditions for economic growth. And then the private sector will take up where it exactly is supposed to be. But they can't do the things that we have to do in the public.
President Daniels, do you concur with that?
Not really.
Well, sure, in large part, but look, one advantage to federalism is that it has a self-correcting mechanism built into it. So jurisdictions that do dumb things long enough, will lose. By the way, let me preface anything I say for the rest of the hour by praising the mayor. He is an exception that proves the rule.
Thank God I only have 3.5 months left in my career. It will be over after that.
Well, you've done enough. You've said enough brave things. They were probably going to end it anyway, where you live. He's been with the possible exception of Governor Raimondo in Rhode Island, the only person in his party who's been willing to speak up about one of the biggest problem that we're facing, not just nationally, but in too many states, and that is the devouring of public resources by pensions and by carelessly created, usually Medicaid systems, which are the Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid at the state level. And he has spoken bravely about it and been able to do a few things locally, I guess, that have preserved some fiscal flexibility so that you can do anything. No smart idea is worth very much if you can't effect it, if you can't implement it. But I'm tempted to say that one of the most effective state governmental economic policies I know of has been Illinois' on behalf of Indiana and Wisconsin and neighboring states, where we are experiencing an influx of jobs and residents statewide. But again, I want to separate what the mayor has done and what he has said about it. I only wish that more people were joining him.
So here is, I actually think long-term, not in the next 3.5 months, but long-term. And I think cities are a laboratory of progressive politics. Not the free community college. California, just the new governor just announced they're going to do it. Tennessee's doing it. Arkansas, Kentucky, Rhode Island, and Hawaii are all replicating it in one place or another. The reason I'm talking about fiscal, I've dealt with healthcare costs and retirement, and the governor is right about this. I love my job as mayor. Better than chief of staff, congressman, and senior advisor all combined. Not even close. And it's not close. The problem for the national government right now is that it's basically a defense department that pays an annuity on health care and Social Security. And at local governments, and I'm not talking about slash and burn, because I believe in retirement security and I believe in health care security, that if you don't figure out how to manage those legacy costs, you're going to become a replica of the national government. You'll be a police and fire department that pays health care and retirement benefits. And we'll squeeze out all progressive investments in universal pre-K, kindergarten, free community college. And it's not to slash and burn or to cut just to eviscerate, but because if we don't watch it, the small local governments that are, or state governments that are coming up with innovative ideas, they will be crowded out to the sideline, and cities and states will look like miniature versions of the national government.
So my question is, let's say you get this crowd out problem under control and you have more resources to spend on things that would promote opportunity. President Daniels, where would you invest those resources?
Catherine, you know the old joke about the economists on the desert island, and they finally found a can of corn, you know, first assume a can opener.
But that's what we're here to
Well,
discuss. What kinds of
I'll-
policies should we be investing in?
I'll join you and assume the can opener, but
Okay.
long as we agree, as Ram and I just did, if you don't get at this problem, then this is genuinely, literally an academic discussion we're having. No, I mean, please notice that the areas we are now learning with the greatest income inequality in the country are exactly the places that, and not Chicago as far as I know, but the places that are implementing these policies you're talking about. You know, we capped property taxes in Indiana at 1% of the value of your house, 2% of your farm or business, 3% of your farm, rental property, 3% of your business. They are now, on average, a third or less of the, you know, the same house could be half a mile away across the Illinois state line. You know, this has macro policies of that kind, I think, at least at the state level, are where the focus ought to be. I'm not against trying to deal with the symptoms of the problem, and we did. I'm a supporter of more available community college for those who can't already afford it. But let's just recognize we are treating symptoms. We are dealing with usually the failures of the system at other levels, and ultimately of cultural problems that even the best K-12 school or local economic policy struggles to overcome.
I mean, I've laid it out in the 5 T's. If I had an extra dollar, I'd probably put 50 cents in, not probably, in education, another 25 cents in, obviously, I would say transportation, but infrastructure as a whole. And the other 25 cents I would put into the other pieces of more access, whether it's around technology and other areas. But to me that, look, if I go back to my days nationally, this is more for Austin, Goolsby than me, but I bet there's nothing the Chinese or any competitors doing that that will beat us. Nothing. We're a great country with unbelievable capacity and unbelievable entrepreneurship and innovation. Invest in ourselves, and then we'll take care of the Chinese. And our biggest challenge is we're not investing in ourselves, whether that's in the transportation system or the people that make up this great country, or people that want to come to this country and contribute to the greatness. And if we just do those things fundamentally right, and I would divide those dollars in those areas, everything else, in my view, in a fundamental way, would take care of itself. From an economic standpoint, I can't agree with Mitch more. There's a whole host of social and cultural issues that are also require equal attention.
So, but what are the policy tools that we have for those? Are there policy tools?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, I don't know, Mitch, you want to go first?
If you want, and I would love if you could specify what kinds of cultural
well, let me say
both
this.
of you.
On the education front, K-12 is outdated. It's pre-K to college. You're going to have to start earlier, go longer, full stop. When I became mayor, we did not have universal kindergarten. We had no universal pre-K. We now have universal full-day kindergarten for every child, and we now are embarking, we're in this first of 4-year phase-in of universal full-day pre-K for every child. We added an hour and 15 minutes to every day for every child, 2 weeks to every year, 4 years of more educational time than a decade earlier. Second, through the Chicago Star Scholarship, dual credit, dual enrollment in our high schools. 50% of our kids now graduate with college credit out of high school, and we've made community college free, so we've made 14th grade the new universal. Starting next year, to get your walking papers at high school, and this, we're the first school system to do it, you must produce a letter, and we'll support you and help you starting freshman year. A letter from either college, community college, vocational school, or a branch of the armed services. Every child, not just the Emmanuel and Daniel's children, will have a post-high school education plan on high school graduation day. And that is a requirement that, and we will give support. You know, one of the things I'm most proud about the Chicago Star Scholarship is 81% of the kids that are taking it have no family member that's ever gone to college. And if we're gonna be everything we wanna be as a country, everybody in here, I don't know everybody, we got 2 things we share: love of our parents and a good education. And if we don't figure out how to get more people in the winner's circle, this deal's over. And I just can't stress enough about how much in a period of time, as I said, where you earn what you learn, to do that. And so I would start with the comprehensive redo of the education system, starting much, much earlier and going longer on the other end, rather than thinking public education is a K through 12 model.
President Daniels.
So it's no mystery at all where almost all this originates. It's in the collapse of the family. It's been going on for decades. It's not going to turn around, apparently. Unwise policy may have propelled it, but maybe it was going to happen anyway. So we are where we are. Why are we stretching what was 1 to 12, now K to 12, now pre-K to 12? Why are we stretching it further and further and further back? Because it's more and more obvious that too many children are arriving without having had any support for education at home, no sense of character, no sense of the discipline, just the routine skills that are necessary not just to succeed in school, but thereafter. And so we have to try to fill that gap. I'd be careful saying we need to invest more. We spend vastly more per kid in this country than any place on earth. We're not getting results for it. And it's, decades of seminars like this have been held on this subject, but if you want to sum it up, unless we find a way to reprofessionalize and education, public education, and bring more competition to it, we shouldn't expect more results, no matter how much more we pour in the top of that funnel. And I've been a party to some changes that are delivering results, much better results. Indiana has gone from nowhere to 4th and 6th in the country in 4th and 8th grade reading and math, and these indicators of, we hope, longer term success. Arnie Duncan, who worked with us on a lot of this stuff, labeled us one of his 2-star states or something. So it's not impervious to change, but it is the most, you're dealing with the most powerful special interest. You've got the scars too.
I'm still a young man.
Yeah. The most powerful collection of special interests that we deal with, and nothing, not studies, not proven results from reform, ever changes their outlook, and they never go away.
Look, I don't disagree with Mitch one iota about family. And I actually think somebody once asked a different question to me, basically about mayor, what did you learn? And I said, you know what was most fascinating to me when I became mayor, Zachariah was a freshman in high school. Alana was a 7th grader, and Leah was a 5th grader. Those are my 3 kids, in case that wasn't clear. At least that's what I'm told. But they definitely are my kids. They have an attitude that it's clearly by genes, okay? So that said, and then being mayor and being exposed in a whole different way than only a mayor can be exposed, or a governor, but clearly a mayor of a big city. And I've come away as a zealot about family. Absolutely a zealot. And just last week, we won an award as a city because I put 8,000, or funded, we went from 0 to 8,000 young men from 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th grade are now in a mentoring program, 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, 9 months a year. And it's called BAM, Becoming a Man. It was this inspiration for President Obama's My Brother's Keeper. It's another program associated with it called WOW, Working on Womanhood. Amy, my wife, has taken a big lead role, and there's about 1,500 young women that we fund. And Mitch is not wrong, but the fact that you can't be advocating for the federal government or the state government to be doing something on family because that would violate all your policies. So that said, that is not wrong that it's a big factor. Therefore, the question is, do you just observe a problem or do you try to address it? I do think the impetus behind early childhood, whether it's pre-K to kindergarten or both ideally, and then toddler programs associated with parental education are key, rather than just saying, okay, we got a problem, and there is no dollars that you're going to figure out on parenting. One, it's going to be a quagmire of fighting. You have to do it, so let's get to the business of doing it and doing it right. The second thing, because observing the problem and just throwing up your hands and blaming people or associating blame is never going to give that child a chance. Get them in an education, get them in a place 8 hours a day that can bend and give them an opportunity is key. And I've walked away fundamentally believing that the biggest challenge one of the biggest challenges we have is around family, but you're going to have to address it through a whole series of different ways to speak about it. And not only speak about it, but fund it. And it is true, that said, we got to get on with the business and saving these kids and giving them a chance in life.
Do you see more of a role for the federal government to be supporting initiatives at the state and local level? And when I say supporting, I mean through money or through other...
That would be welcome.
That would be welcome. Well, I mean, presumably states and cities don't have the same budget constraints that the federal government does, which President Daniels may or may not think is a good thing. But are there ways that federal policymakers could be supporting the efforts of state and local policymakers, or getting out of the way, for that matter?
Well, I was going to say liberating as much as supporting. You know, if they want to borrow a little more money they don't have and make their problem worse and send it to states and localities, as long as it doesn't come with the usual strings and mandates attached. I'll give you a good example. I mean, something Ron talked about that's extremely important is building the backbone of a thriving private economy that we call infrastructure. And we all know we're way behind in this country, and a lot of hand-wringing going on and non-starter ideas out here. Look, if you actually try to build things, and we built more infrastructure per capita than any state in the country. We got lucky and hit a jackpot and monetized an existing toll road at just the right time, cashed a $4 billion check and built stuff that otherwise would have stayed on the books for
Which
another.
was very controversial at the time.
Well, only if you don't look at the facts. It was at the time. It is absolute slam dunk, and anybody who wants a full download on that, stand back.
You would agree. You would agree with this. I have this argument at home all the time. I said, if politics was rational, you don't need us. It's an emotional business. Yeah. Okay, that's what this is.
Well, let me just anyway. The point is, take infrastructure. First of all, there's an enormous amount of private capital. It's been sitting there for years and years and years waiting. On the day that we announced that we'd hit the jackpot, I'll never forget this. This is now 12 years ago. People gasped, the air went out of the room. No one thought we would be offered as much money, close to as much, including me, as much money as we were. And I said, listen, this is a big deal. On the day we close this transaction, it'll be the biggest such transaction in American history by a factor of 2, the Chicago Skyway being just about half its size. I said, but that won't last. This makes so much sense. And the nation needs to rebuild itself. So of course, it's not all rational. And 12 years later, it's still. Ed Rendell was the governor of Pennsylvania at the time. He called me up right away and said, I got to do this. He said, the Pennsylvania Turnpike is exactly the same, could be the same formula. And he told me that his engineers told him they had 10,000 substandard bridges in the state that he had to worry about, people getting hurt. And his legislature blocked him from cashing a $13 billion check with which he could have rebuilt Pennsylvania. It's absolutely absurd. By the way, it was Republicans as much as Democrats who got in the way. The federal government is still making it difficult to do these so-called P3 transactions, and it's a darn shame. Go around the world, and Catherine, you have. Surprisingly, America, the land of innovation, we like to tell ourselves, is the world's laggard in P3 construction of necessary infrastructure. And the last thing I'll say about this is, when you finally get the money, if you manage to assemble the resources, go try to get an environmental permit through for example, the NEPA law. That thing is way out of date, and I could give you other examples. That's just the worst. You want to know what the federal government could do? Enable you to build something in less than 10 years.
No, all right, three quick things. You know, since I live in a city that my predecessor privatized the parking meter, you're not going to, which is, he brought Cubs and Sox fans together in a unique way. 100% of the city's opposed to that deal, okay? You are not going to solve infrastructure problems just privatizing. I'm not against it. It's a tool in the toolbox. It's not the toolbox. So I'm going to come back to that in a second. The thing I will agree with Mitch on, and I've advocated for this, you know, we were trying to build we built a train station near McCormick Place on the south side of Chicago, near South Side. I had to do an environmental study. The state then had to go over our environmental study, and then the feds did. Forget it. It should be consolidated, but that's not the biggest problem. And it was a dirt piece of land. I said, it's a subway station, for God's sakes. And I told President Obama, I said, this is nuts. I do a study, the state has to then replicate that study, and then we have to submit it to the feds, which take another 6 months. What you lose is the cost of time. It is to driver some cost. But on infrastructure, and I disagree with Mitch, I've advocated for it. I recently did for our state. Mitch's successor has raised the gas tax in Indiana. Wisconsin has, Michigan has. 24 of the 50 states have already raised the gas tax. I'm for it in Illinois. And I was up front. I took a lot of money out of Washington and brought it back to Chicago in the last 8 years. We have now, as I said, 97% on-time arrival, 93% satisfaction in our mass transit system. We're the only ones with 4G on the complete system. In 2020, every rail car will be new. Half the track in the city is basically new, and we've upgraded a third of all of our stations. We're doing that at O'Hare and Midway. We'll be the only Global Alliance terminal in the United States of America. We added a third airport because when you look at the runway expansion, Midway's capacity has been lifted and added to O'Hare. And we just today, FAA surpassed Atlanta as the busiest airport in the United States. Thank you for that. I love that comment. Now, here's my view is you cannot invest in infrastructure on the cheap. You want to sell assets? Great. It is not going to get you where you need to be. And
well, neither will the gas tax, Ron.
Okay, I agree with you.
I mean, get real. Here's another thing the federal government can do, Catherine.
I was being like civil. It's over. Civil hour's over. Here's the deal. You cannot get there. We're being like, Mitch is a great governor. Forget about it now. Mitch, you can't get there just selling your assets.
I didn't say it. Well, first of all, do some homework. We didn't sell anything. We still own it.
Yeah.
We just have somebody. We just have somebody competent
you'll get it back in 75
instead of patronage workers.
I just wanted to show that Mitch was the first to violate the civil code we had.
No. Look,
come on, Mitch.
I'm going to try to agree with you. First of all, I never said that it was the whole answer. It's not. It's
a piece of the puzzle.
You will never invert the argument you made. You'll never solve it in a bankrupt country with a lot of bankrupt states trying to do it simply the old-fashioned way. So we ought to be inviting in both. What's P3 stand for? Public and private. Of course you have to have both sources. But you raise a really good example. Another thing the federal government can do is let states, and I guess localities could play too, have more freedom to apply tolling. It's a much fairer way to finance infrastructure because the user pays When you got people passing through Chicago from out of state, they're not paying anything to you right now unless they happen to stop for gas.
I'd be for all you people that come for a weekend to pay.
On a tolling basis, it's a genuine user fee and could be another very valuable source. But the federal government has consistently
I would prefer
impeded the opportunity
to be a national. Here's where President Clinton will tell you this. When he passed the gas tax in '93, they should have indexed it. It'd be worth about $20 billion more a year in capacity to bond, et cetera. The reason and there's a classic of what you're trying to figure out, the reason 24 out of the 50 states have already passed a gas tax is because there's nothing happening in Washington, and nobody relies on it. And let me give you how broke Washington is. It's not financially, but it's actually politically. So California just announced they're doing free community college, just like Chicago. Tennessee does it. Arkansas is doing it. Kentucky's doing it. Rhode Island, Hawaii, Oregon, and now California. Do you think anybody is getting on a plane to go to the Secretary of Education to talk to her about what's happening? You have the state of California, the 6th largest economy in the world. Do you think they've called any of us? On a basic, what education policy today has 3 Republican governors and 4 Democratic governors agreeing? You find me 1. Now, you have no federal interest in this, and no state interested in telling the federal government about it. That is a fundamental breakdown. And if and so what's really changing in America, we used to think of laboratories of democracy, ideas, and then they would float out. It is no longer a vertical process. It's a horizontal process. California is learning from Tennessee. Mitch just gave us in the green room an example where he had the idea of free community college. Wasn't there. Tennessee took it. And California's taken it. Oregon's taken it. And nobody is getting on a plane to see Betsy DeVos, and she is not sending anybody to study it. And nobody cares anymore. Washington is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and an aircraft carrier. And you're not going to come here to find innovation on policy. It is all going to happen locally, and it's all going to stay locally. And that's the frightening thing about it.
So I have a question about this. In terms of the tension between different layers of government, one thing we haven't talked about is the tension in many states between the state policymakers and the local policymakers in the form of preemption. I don't know if this is actually going on in Illinois. I assume not.
Are you kidding?
No.
You
Apologies.
don't have to
I know in
you
Indiana.
don't have to ask that question.
I know in Indiana, at the state level, they've preempted the minimum wage and I think paid sick leave maybe and some other things like that. I mean, do either of you have thoughts on whether that's an appropriate use of state power if in fact we want to allocate more decision making to people who are closer to the on-the-ground problems?
I mean, I'd view it case by case. There are certainly situations, and there are legitimate situations, federal to state too, where you don't want a patchwork, where you don't want, businesses having to deal with 50 vastly different systems. So I don't think there's one rule, Catherine, that it's always inappropriate. But I will say that it probably does have its place if and when. I don't think we've had it in our state, but I read about other places where cities are doing things that might be injurious to the state interest.
So let me give you an example. In 2015, I had a commission, blue ribbon panel. So we went to, a lot of people were advocating $15 minimum wage. Illinois was 8.25, still is 8.25. Will end this week, actually, because the governor's pushing now, go to 15. And we'll succeed in passing it. But my decision was, so we did a 5-year roll-in, and this June we'll hit 13. And my point was we should, and we've taken 100,000 people in the city out of poverty. And it's not just minimum wage, it was also expanding the EITC, it was also obviously the health of the economy, blah, 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 a lot of other factors. But the minimum wage was a big driver. And we did it in a way, phased in over time. Chamber then went from opposing, or business groups, from opposing to neutral, not for it. I happen to think doing it in conjunction with an expanded state earned income tax credit was the right way to go. That said, Illinois did not pass an increase in the minimum wage. and I'm just going to take a shot here, Mitch. And Mitch said that Illinois exports a lot of talent. Not wrong. But during a period of time that we had the lowest minimum wage, it was not like we raced our way to the bottom. So it was a way to lift people. We didn't see an exodus of jobs and economic growth. Today, Chicago has the highest employment and the lowest unemployment in the history of the city. And it grew people's incomes without adjusting or dislocating the economy. I don't think the state should have passed a law that basically exempt the city, a big city, that was a driver of economic growth, from basically finding a way to bring more equitable approaches to that minimum wage and to that income and to living in the city.
And this is going to be my last question for the panel, so if you all have questions on your note cards, I think we're going to start collecting those now. The last big topic that I wanted to talk with you about is the idea of carrots versus sticks when it comes to promoting economic opportunity. So I mentioned earlier, and as we have discussed, a lot of states have been doing things to either increase minimum wage or otherwise support work, reward work through the EITC, things like that. But then you also see, on the other hand, a lot of states embracing sticks, essentially, work requirements. You lose your Medicaid, you lose your food stamps if you do not meet particular hourly work requirements, monthly work requirements, things like that. Could the two of you talk a little bit about balancing those kinds of tools, which tools you think are more or less effective?
Yeah, well, I have pretty much a live and let live attitude about this, because once again, I have faith in what I think we've always seen and see it very plainly today, and that is, I say, a self-correcting mechanism. You do dumb things long enough, look at the exodus of people from certain localities and certain states where people are fleeing high taxation or what they see as onerous business requirements. And so let people try it. They have to make their own decisions, and I hope we'll always be a diverse country in that respect. I don't know if it's quite responsive, Catherine, but I see a lot of states and localities doing things I think are really ill-judged and maybe irresponsible in this whole economic development area. We had very, very firm rules that we established at the outset of my one time in elected office about what we would and wouldn't do. We were as aggressive as any state around in trying to recruit new business, but no front-end money, no incentive that wasn't strictly conditional and proven and that is audited, no jobs, no tax relief or rebate of training dollars, that sort of thing. And we've seen, I think, a lot of states being very reckless with their public resources. Or there's nothing more dangerous than to give a politician the public checkbook in this area. He gets to cut the ribbon and the bills come in under some successor. And I think that's an area that requires continued vigilance, and there's been some really good journalism on this area, and I think it needs to continue.
I have different examples, but since you're familiar with the Chicago Star, I have a B average. That was the policy we set up. I got a lot of pushback about why should there be any grade point average now? We don't have a state doing it, and I had to come up with the dollars, city of Chicago. But I actually do believe what President Clinton used to say, you can't get something for nothing. You should have some skin in the game. And if you take responsibility, we should provide opportunity. That's a good contract. So my general, rather than carrot and stick, is if you perform, we're going to reward you with opportunity. And I think that's still the right kind of balance. Rather than punishment and reward, put some skin in the game, and we'll create the opportunity.
All right, I have a couple of questions from the audience. Many community colleges have a rate of students requiring remedial. I think this is meant to be a high rate of students requiring remedial education. Rate of students requiring remedial education of greater than 50%. How should state and local government address this challenge? We were talking about this in the green room, actually.
Yeah, no, it's a reality that's sobering in two ways. One is that a lot of these people in community college, we all have high hopes for these folks being able to leave community college, be really ready for a job of today, whereas a high percentage of them are just trying to get to a line that we once associated with getting out of high school. And so on top of that, we know that if anybody in the room knows of a remediation program that's really been highly, highly successful, I'd like to know, because the record, once you get them there, and I'm all for the remediation happening, but we're not very good at doing it once they get there. And as I think I said, and I'm only half facetious about this, this is the warranty repair work for a failed K-12 system. These are people who left high school, and it turns out they're not even close to what we would have should expect from a high school graduate. So we have to spend public money a second time. Some state somewhere is going to say, enough of this. We're going to track those kids back. You're going to pay. You, the K-12 system that claimed they were a graduate, you're going to pay for the warranty. You're going to give a warranty, and we're going to charge you for it.
Two things. On our STAR scholarship, if you get a B average in high school, we make it free. That's basically been probably an insurance policy. One of the things I would not have, so if you're not familiar with community colleges, and I look across the room, I'm making a judgment, not a big exposure to it. So 40% of the population is getting an associate's degree. This is at 10,000 feet, and I can only speak about Chicago. 40% are getting an associate's degree. 20% are getting their GED or equivalent. And the next 40% are kind of working, and they're taking a class here, a credit there, and plussing up their skills. So don't think of the community college population in a monolithic term. That's number one. So our entire conversation is about the associate's degree. At least in Chicago, they're less than half. They're 40%, significant. The energy goes there. But don't think of it in a monolithic term with your mind's eye. 4-year, this is just a 2-year version of the 4-year. And one of the big things we did to make ours successful is we ripped off everything going on in Germany. So Malcolm X is all about healthcare. We have a hospital in Malcolm X, a replica. So we do EMT work, we do emergency room, nursing work, but we replicated an entire new building with a healthcare system in it. We just opened up Richard J. Daley with an entire new wing on advanced digital manufacturing. And it's in a replica of every machine within about a 5-mile, not every machine, but a 5-mile radius of that campus that's in all our manufacturing area. So the kids are going to learn on something that's actually on the factory floor today. Olive Harvey is a replica. It's this TDL facility on transportation, distribution, logistics. In fact, Walmart and Coyote Logistics designed the campus or the building so it would look like what exactly a modern TDL facility is. So the school system is with each school is aligned with the sector of the economy that's growing at the fastest rate and creating the most jobs. I cannot stress this point enough, that if you want to grow economically, you got to guarantee or ensure the private sector an educated, skilled workforce. They will scour the world for it, and if you create it, they will come.
Catherine, can I just insert an Aspen commercial? Most people here will know this, but they've run this competition among community colleges, and I was lucky enough to be a part of that with Congressman George Brown was the sidekick on it. And so for a couple, 3 years, they made an exhaustive study try to find the best ones, and it was really inspiring. There's I think the most heroic work going on in education is probably at the community college level. I think the mayor and I are just trying to remind everybody that how difficult this challenge is, and
it is tough.
I wish it was all about sort of upskilling people for that next great job, but it's a little more complicated and tough than that.
And if you think, trying to see if a reporter from Chicago sometimes is still in. If you think the K through 12 educational institutional players are a problem, you have not met the higher education, educational interest groups.
Okay, so this is a good segue to my next question from the audience.
And that's all I'll say, and that's as vanilla as an Emmanuel has ever been.
Okay. What can we learn from what Governor Daniels has done at Purdue regarding educational policy and incentives? What are the lessons for states and lessons for the United States?
I'm not talking about it. We don't prescribe anything we're doing at Purdue University. I will just say, though, that for anybody but ourselves, I will say that I guess that sometimes we just overlook the simplest things in addressing problems like this. Simple things like if you want people to have more income, don't take so much of it from them, or keep the cost of living down. You know, but you know, if you don't want students to have to borrow so much money, don't charge them so much in the first place. And if you make that a real target, you can make more progress than most people probably think you can. And so at our university, maybe the questioner knew this, we're just trying to decide right now whether what has been a 7-year freeze on tuition with lower housing and board costs can be extended another year. Sooner or later, we'll have to do something. We'll have to make an adjustment, but it'll be cheaper to attend our university in 2020, which is year 7, in nominal unadjusted dollars than it was in 2012. And so guess what? Student borrowing is down dramatically because we didn't charge them so much to start with. Beyond that, though, we're just trying to find our way, much like I think the federal system. We've got a wonderfully diverse set of colleges and universities in this country, and we all try to learn from each other. And I'm always trying to plagiarize something smart that somebody else did that we didn't think of.
Next question. Chicago and Indiana have higher capacity than most jurisdictions to use data and analytics to innovate and improve. What could or should the federal government do to help more states and local governments build analytical capacity to spend federal dollars well?
Get a pizza because we're going to be here to dinner, okay? That's like, you know, I'm not, here's why the question's not fair if I can. Well,
I didn't ask it, so
well,
no offense taken.
No, Mitch made the example of what Ed Rendell said. This isn't, even if you have the data, what you really are doing is trying to prove that you can win an argument. Because the truth is, if it was all data-driven, you wouldn't actually need Aspen Institute. This is not, I want to repeat, politics, electoral politics, and the system we have is not a rational system. It's based a lot on how people feel emotionally. It has resentment in it. It has aspiration in it. And if you look at it as just a data-driven process, you're not understanding how to make change. It ain't going to happen that way. And there's a whole host of things. And the truth is the federal government does a pretty good job of getting and collecting data. What it does with it and how it informs everything else is the political process. And I'm not so sure that there's a lack of data. There may be sometimes a lack of political will, and there may be sometimes the fact is that people want to come to their arguments with their own data. And so I'm not sure that's going to help, quote unquote, resolve or untangle a lot of political entanglements. Can I do one thing?
Yes.
We were talking about, so I agree with the gas tax. You can probably tell Mitch doesn't. In Chicago, we went, but Mitch said something recently about Purdue, and it made me think about something we did at our CTA, our mass transit system. So we went 6 years without a rate increase. And we did a lot of better management of our resources, plowing it in. We got a lot more federal money, et cetera. We also were the first city to start tapping into the rideshare industry that goes into, put 25 cents, and I said it would take we'll invest in certain improvements that will take 5 minutes off everybody's ride on the rail system. So we did a lot of stuff where there were slow zones, et cetera. We eventually got to a point where we then raised 25 cents on the ride. Now I was preparing, not that there wasn't blowback and I didn't do it casually, but I was proposing, I thought I was going to get a bigger blowback when I did do it. And not that there wasn't a problem, but having gone 6 years without a rate increase, making improvements that materially related to people's lives, I think diminished the blowback. And I would say to you that part of our discussion here is people don't usually want to pay more money to get the same thing that they get. They'll give you more money if you're giving them something new. On what you're supposed to be doing, their attitude is, here's your budget, go do it. And I think if you're trying to find political will to solve some of the big, tangible, tough problems, you're going to have to basically prove to people you can run a one-car parade. And that's what they're going to look for. And I think at least for me, There's a lot of political lessons out of that process. And I was trying to give Mitch a little advice before the Purdue tuition goes up.
And then I think we have time for one more question. Can somebody let me know if that is incorrect? I think okay, yes, I see nodding, okay. So this is a question for President Daniels. If you're concerned about the collapse of the family driving the issues, which I assume you mean as the rise of single-parent households, which is only an issue for lower income families, then why don't you support policies to boost wages, since higher income people are more likely to marry and stay married and have children in wedlock?
Well, first of all, don't assume I don't support some. The question is what'll work and what won't. And you know, the entire focus of 8 years in elected office was to raise the disposable income of Hoosiers. And I said over and over again, our job was not to see that wealthy people ever make any more money. It's to make sure that more people have a chance to become wealthier than they are. You know, chicken and egg here. No one needs to take it from me. There's a Himalaya of data on this, goes back decades, that every, not just economic, every social pathology and problem we deal with is closely correlated to the collapse of the family. And it is not just in low-income categories anymore. As has been amply illustrated by more recent scholarship, it's now spread across the middle class, what we thought of as middle class population, the white population. It doesn't respect any of these boundaries. And I'm not here to decry it, I'm just here to note that in the face of that, we are going to have to do things, including extending education back earlier and earlier, that simply weren't necessary in days gone by. It's a reality, not a judgment I'm making.
Well, thank you again to our audience, to our panelists for a very lively discussion, and thank you for the questions.